Good morning. If everybody could get their last cup of coffee, or not the last, but get a cup of coffee and some water, we can get started. My name is Rick Cockrum. I'm the president of the board of directors of the Indiana Wildlife Federation. I want to welcome you to a live event. We're so excited to see people. It's been 3 years since we've all been able to get together, and the planning committee did an extraordinary job the last 2 years making this a virtual event, but we have a hybrid now. We're streaming live, but we're also able to get together and see each other. In fact, so excited about being live, I thought too late to put it into the script to have everybody come up and shout live, Saturday morning live from Fort Harrison. So I want to thank the planning committee. If anybody that's done anything remotely like this knows that there's a lot of details and a lot of work and a lot of logistics. And this team's been meeting all year to plan this. John Goss, who's also a board member, is on the plan committee. Chuck Brinkman, former board member. Ray Watkins. Ray does the silent auction. And so check out those. We've got a lot of generous items donated. Be sure to bid on those because the bidding's open for a few more hours yet. Tina Mayhern, and also a board member, Tina Mayhern, is Aaron Stump, who's on staff. Our habitat management director, and our new executive director, who you'll meet in a little bit, Dan Borrett. The last person that we got to thank in that group is the chair. And sometimes you need to do more than say more. So I'd like Tom Holman to come up, if he could come up and be recognized. Tom, can we have you? Calling you? Everybody, Tom is the chair. Come on up. We want to say thank you. Tom, we want to present this to you on the condition you agree to do it again next year. I'm just kidding. Everybody, we just wanted to show a token of our appreciation for Tom Holman for the work he's done in chairing this group for the last many years. And it's just unbelievable, the ship that he runs, the tight ship that he runs. He holds people accountable, believe me. When he writes down in the minutes what's expected of you, you better deliver at the next meeting.
Well, we meet at microbreweries. That makes it better. So
yeah, we do meet at microbreweries, and it's even more important that there are minutes.
yeah.
So thank you very much.
Thank you.
We don't, so last year we had announcement that our executive director, Emily Wood, was taking a career move and moving on to a great job in Wisconsin. It was a great move for her, but it gave the board some anxiety and some stress. The executive committee, which consists of myself and Craig Carpenter, Stacy Kachulis, and Brent Taylor, who are all here. We served as the search committee. We accepted almost 40 applications and resumes, and we opened one, and it was a eureka. You'll meet Dan in a little bit, but Dan Borrett is our new executive director. Dan came to us from managing Holiday Park in the city. Prior to that, he curated at the Indianapolis Zoo. And prior to that, he worked at the Smithsonian Zoo in Washington, D.C. Science background in his education, has done a lot of work in habitat management around the state, a wealth of knowledge of wildlife. In fact, I found out at dinner last night that a Carolina chickadee can lower its body temperature to 42 degrees. Walking around knowledge when you're a wildlife expert. So a couple of other board members here, Lindsay Moss, want to make sure, Lindsay, and Quentin Collins. I think Quentin's out at the desk there. I want to thank our sponsors, their generosity to help this happen. And again, the people that donated to the silent auction. So with that, I'd like to have Dan come on up. You guys have a great day. Enjoy the camaraderie, enjoy the experience, the education, and have fun. Dan?
Morning, everybody. Thank you guys for coming out. I'm so fortunate to be here and be able to have an in-person conference. It's great to gather again with people with similar interests and passions. And I think we're in for a really, really special day. As Rick said, this process started well before I was in the picture. So the planning committee has really, really done an excellent job. I'm just fortunate to get to come in and reap the rewards of it at the end. So again, planning committee, thank you all so much for this. It's a big lift and I appreciate it. I will try to keep this brief because you're going to unfortunately hear from me 2 more times today. So you'll be sick of my voice as I'm already sick of it. But I want to start by introducing our keynote speaker, who I had the pleasure of getting to have dinner with last night. And she's wonderful in conversation and even better when it comes to sharing her passion for cranes in this country. Ann Lacey, who you'll meet in just a moment, is in charge of North American programs for the International Crane Foundation, and knows more about cranes in this country and worldwide than probably the rest of this room collectively could ever hope to know. She can answer questions with grace and comedy, and I think we're really in for a treat. I'm really looking forward to her lecture. So without further ado, our keynote speaker for the day, Ann Lacey.
Thank you for that. I'm glad that the passion shows through and the knowledge and the humor. All right, which button? I could also just do it the old-fashioned way.
I guess I should have.
No, yeah, wasn't.
Yeah, we're good.
That's me.
Yep.
There we go. Okay, yeah, me. I started at the International Crane Foundation in 2000 as an intern, and we have a really, really strong intern project in all of our main project areas in our headquarters. At least we do have international programs as well. The International Crane Foundation is headquartered in Baraboo, Wisconsin. We are a science-based organization, but we also do a lot of outreach. We do a lot of species banking, and that's what we focus on at our headquarters. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. Please visit. We're up in the water park capital of the world, Wisconsin Dells. Don't go there. Come to the International Crane Foundation. So what I would love to talk with you about today is cranes of North America, and that's a little bit of hyperbole because of the 15 species that are found worldwide. We have 2 cranes in North America. But the contrast of those 2 is pretty distinct. So of course we have the sandhill crane, which I'm hoping that all of you have seen at some point flying over or at one of the many stopovers and wintering areas here in Indiana. The most common of the 15 crane species is the sandhill crane. We also have the whooping crane, which is the rarest of the 15 species. And you can go to several places here in Indiana and see both of them just wandering around, which is kind of amazing. So starting off with just the sandhills, they are a North American species. Let me see if I can find, but they also breed in Asia. And some of them decide that they don't want to cross over the Bering Sea. Why should I go all the way back down here to winter in Mexico when I can just, skip over and go to China? So more and more sandhills are actually being seen in wintering areas in Asia. But their breeding area is very vast. Look at the different ecosystems that those birds inhabit. So they are the most numerous because they are generalists. They can deal with all of these habitats and make do. And one thing that really drives this point home is that there are 3 non-migratory subspecies in Mississippi, which is an endangered species. Has anybody been to the Mississippi Sandhill Crane Wildlife Refuge? Gorgeous. It's in the ecosystem is probably more endangered than the crane. The longleaf pine wetland ecosystem is gorgeous down there. Please visit. Also Florida, which is state threatened. They were up for federal listing and didn't quite make the cut. And due to all of the reasons that you can probably imagine, they're not doing that well in Florida, but they're also in Cuba, non-migratory species. And they are also an endangered species down there. subspecies. There are 3 migratory subspecies that are found in different flyways and in different populations. So those kind of words, I juggle through those. But seeing the difference here, we, in the eastern population, we only have the greater subspecies. There's a Canadian subspecies and lesser, very well named. The Canadian is in the middle, and there's an asterisk by the Canadian because so a subspecies is typically their morphological characteristics that are different. And in the case of sandhills, it is strictly body size that is the difference there. The Canadian being in the middle, depending on who you talk to, there are people that believe this subspecies exists. And there was a paper that was published back in 2001, Reimer, that he thought that there was not enough genetic differentiation to even call it a subspecies. It was just a morphological variant of the greater, the Tabata subspecies. So depending on who you talk to, you can still, by measurement, kind of discern Canadian subspecies. I would not be able to pick them out. And if I go to the Platte River and George Archibald is pointing out, look, there's a Canadian sandhill crane, and all I can do is say, sure. What am I going to argue with George Archibald, the co-founder of the International Crane Foundation and a Canadian? Yes. So those 3 migratory subspecies are found in various populations and flyways. So perhaps most famously, the mid-continent. Has anybody been to the Platte River to see the migration? Tell everybody how much they need to go and see that. Why else would you go to Nebraska in March? To see that. Is there anybody from Nebraska? Love Nebraska, love it in March. And also go to see the Sand Hills, which is a place, which is also a beautiful, beautiful area in Nebraska. So that is the mid-continent population. And as far as populations go, also the most numerous, at least 1 million birds in just that flyway, in that population. All 3 subspecies are found there. The Pacific and Central Flyway going along right along the Pacific coast, the lessers that are breeding up in that little section of Alaska, Canadians in Canada, some graders also, so they're kind of latitudinally divided up amongst themselves there, those 2 flyways. Rocky Mountain population is exclusively the greater subspecies. Those birds that went down Bosque del Apache National Wildlife Refuge in New Mexico, also a place you need to go, very beautiful. Crane festival down there. Most of these places have crane festivals. There's a lot of crane festivals. I have a whole other talk just talking about that. The lower Colorado River Valley population. All of these are short distance migrants. The shorter the migration, you can assume that they're probably greater subspecies. The smallest population. And last, but certainly not least, our very own eastern population of sandhill cranes. So I'll focus on these birds from here on out. So the Fish and Wildlife Service has an annual fall survey to determine the population level of these birds. And the latest number that they have is a 3-year average of about 91,000 birds. It's probably a little bit more than that because it's probably an undercount. And the population trend there is increasing. So to try to, this famously, Aldo Leopold wrote a Marshland Elegy. Show of hands, who's read Marshland Elegy? Again, everybody who has not needs to read that. The Aldo Leopold Foundation is literally down the road from the International Crane Foundation. So that kind of, we're in that milieu. So it's very, very pertinent to us. He wrote that elegy because he thought that he would see those birds die out in his lifetime. And now I kind of wonder what he would think about all of the thousands of birds that are roosting in the Wisconsin River, literally in the shadow. If the shack in Wisconsin threw a shadow on the river, these birds would be in it. So they have made an amazing comeback. Probably much, well, I don't know if it's much sooner than he thought they would or not. But to try to document how these birds are increasing and expanding, this paper that we had published in 2015 was just looking at the breeding bird survey data. So, and these are roughly decadal chunks of time. So the 60s into 1977, 80s, 90s, and then up into the 2000s. And you can see that this star is what I labeled as GMC, is the geographic mean center. So that is the center of the density of where these birds were found. And it's pretty much stays in northeastern Wisconsin, not too far from Green Bay. Go Pack. It has nothing to do with cranes at all. But you can see how the birds have expanded into Minnesota. There's always been birds documented in the UP, but they're expanding. This is very misleading because this time goes into 2013 data-wise. And we know that as early as the late 90s and certainly in the early 2000s, there was documented sandhills breeding in New England states up into Quebec and the other territories up there. So there's lots of sandhills over there that just aren't being documented by the Breeding Bird Survey. So these birds are kind of moving outward from that breeding center, the birds that were always existing in Wisconsin and Michigan. So we can show that same thing looking at the expansion of the wintering areas as well by looking at the Christmas bird count. How many people do a Christmas bird count? Thank you. We use your data. Here it is. I always like to do that because this kind of citizen science data is really, really important. So the same thing, that geographic mean center back in the 70s is almost exclusively in Florida, which are also counting the resident non-migratory sandhills, of course. Go ahead another decade or so, and you can see suddenly there's birds that are wintering. They're being documented. Some of those birds over to the west, of course, are a non-migratory Mississippi population, but up in these wintering areas in Tennessee, North Georgia. And by 2000, there are plenty of birds still being documented in the wintertime in Wisconsin and Michigan. And if you notice that star, that geographic mean center now is almost to Hiawassee, which is a very, used to be staging area, now a large wintering area for sandhills in the Tennessee River, just north of Chattanooga. So the wintering area has expanded greatly, and now you can find sandhills throughout the year in the entirety of the flyway, and lots of birds still being seen in Wisconsin and Michigan. Whether or not we have non-migratory birds, we can discuss that. Possible. So here's looking at that fall survey. So this is sponsored by the Fish and Wildlife Service, but it is a volunteer effort also. They try to get anybody to go out. Our staff at the Crane Foundation counts at least 5 different areas, a lot of them along the Wisconsin River, which is a major staging area for the sandhills. And this is always in the last week of October is when they decided that was when the concentration of birds. And when they count the birds in the mid-continent population, they count them on the Platte River in March, because that's where the concentration is. For us, our birds stage in the fall. They don't stage in the spring. So the easiest place to count these birds is in the last week of October. Birds have probably come out of Canada, but they haven't moved too far south. How far south did they go? So I went down a small rabbit hole and looked at this data specifically from Indiana. And just this 11-year time span from 2010 to 2020. So, about 6,000 to 10,000 birds are being counted in Indiana in that blue. So that's the total from those counties that are, these are the counties where there is a count that takes place. There might be more than one spot in those counties. This orange line is exclusively the birds that were counted in Jasper-Pulaski. So about 76% of all the birds that are counted in Indiana on the Fish and Wildlife Fall Count are from that one spot. More detail, let's see, Henry County. Henry County was counted once in 2010 and there was a 0 and they haven't counted it since. Monroe and Johnson counties have been counted 3 times in that time frame, and they were all 0s. I don't know if they're still counting, but you can see those are all those in that kind of southern tier. So again, this is October. Most of the birds have come into those northern tier counties, and they haven't filtered south quite yet. I wish I could remember 2019. It was a lifetime ago. I don't remember what the migration was quite like that year, but obviously there was something that pushed the birds further south a little bit earlier. And so there was a big slug of birds that was counted here And so that's about 18,000 birds. But to put that in perspective, the total count for that year was 89,000 birds. So still a respectable chunk of birds that have made it into the state by that time. So I'll talk more about where you can find cranes in Indiana in a little bit. So what led to the comeback of the cranes? Well, cranes worldwide are known for their affinity for agriculture. And certainly it was the adaptability of sandhills allowed them to, when European settlement came through, plowed up the prairies and put in corn and or soy instead. They went, oh, all right, this sounds good to me. As long as we kept our wetlands, that was the bigger key. Wisconsin saved about 50% of our historic wetlands, but it was surrounded by agriculture, which they adapted readily to. And it is certainly the reason why there are so many sandhills that are wintering and stopping over and now wintering in Indiana. So not quite a 180-degree turn, but 90 degrees. Let's talk about the whooping crane for a while. So the other crane species we have in North America, it happens to be the rarest and one of the rarest birds in the world. But we can see quite readily here in Indiana. It's a good thing that they're a big, tall, white bird. They're very easy to see. You know, check that right off the list. So the brief history of the whooping crane, of course, famously, about 15 birds were seen down on the Texas coast in the 30s and 40s, and they had no idea where they were breeding. And it wasn't until almost 2 decades later that they found them way up north in Wood Buffalo National Park. Gradually, you know, those two ends of the flyway at least were protected, and the population started creeping up. They began to collect eggs from wood buffalo when they knew that there was usually they lay 2 eggs. They only raise 1 to fledging and migration. So they knew that they would not harm them if they took 1 fertile egg, making sure that 1 fertile egg was left in the nest. And actually there was some research that showed that that's the egg that was left had a better chance of fledging if they took 1 egg. So it was kind of a win-win. This is how we built up our captive population. From our captive populations, then we were able to establish that genetic bank, start increasing the genetic diversity of whooping cranes, and then start reintroductions. So this is the 3rd of 4 whooping crane reintroductions that have been attempted in the lower 48. First was in Gray's Lake in Idaho, where they put the eggs in sandhill crane nests, because of course sandhills are very good parents and they'll do a good job, except that they don't have mirrors. So when you hatch out of an egg and the only thing you see is a gray bird, you think that you're a gray bird. So of course they tried to mate with sandhills, and that was abandoned. The second one was another non-migratory population down in Florida, which was going okay. A lot of costume-reared birds that were put into that population. But between a 10-year drought cycle that was at its lowest ebb in the middle of that, and high adult mortality, there was a lot of power line strikes, for example, and almost zero productivity, that was stopped. And then I'll talk more about our eastern population, started in 2001. And in 2011, another non-migratory population was started in Louisiana. And the difference with that one is that that is actually, there were probably non-migratory whooping cranes, again, you know, pre-settlement times all along the Gulf Coast. But we knew that it was within the last 100 years, there was probably birds in this area of Louisiana. And there was still quite a bit of natural wetlands and things. So that the hope was that this was a better place to put whooping cranes, and they are actually doing quite well in that population, despite only having had only 10 years in. So here is the big story of the eastern migratory population. So let's step through this. On this side, this is the number of individuals that are alive by each year. This black line is the number of total birds that have been released into the population to date. So almost 350 birds that have been released in total. We have 75 that are alive that we know of today. So started out in 2001, famously being led by Ultralight to teach them the migratory route. Ingenious. I mean, we need to come up with these kind of wackadoodle things to bring back migratory species. So large cohort sizes were also, so we could build up that population relatively quickly. And then we started also raising birds in costume and releasing them into the company of these older birds that knew the migration route. So that's in yellow. Parent reared. So it was thinking that maybe it would be better if we actually had real whooping cranes raising these birds and build a better bird. And they were also released into, not yet, into the company of those older birds to learn the migration route. So those are then in red. But what we really need is the green. We really need this population to have that wild hatch population to be a majority. And as of January of this year, the 75 birds that we have, 18 are wild hatch. And most of those are breeding adult age. So the more of those birds that we get out there, ideally, we think that that is what is going to be the key to kind of get them over the hump and get them to self-sustaining status, which is the goal. So we aren't there yet. They are pairing, their behaviors are spot on. They are forming their territories. They are nesting, they're foraging with the beautiful wetlands like Necedah National Wildlife Refuge is where the core of the breeding area is in Wisconsin right now. And they're laying fertile eggs. So that is no small feat. There's problems with other populations that are just not laying fertile eggs, or they're having some issues with viability of their eggs, but that is not the case with us. They are hatching out those lovelies. But this is what we're not getting to. We're not getting those chicks to the age where they are fledged and able to migrate with their parents. So that they are still not getting to that self-sustaining status. We are still augmenting that population at great cost and effort every year. And here's what that looks like in a graph. So the number on this axis by year, the first nest was in 2005. So they have been nesting for a long time. There was only 2 nests that year. So it took a while for these birds to come to breeding age. Cranes don't mature until at least 3, and they might not even be able to nest or parent well until about 4 or 5. So they're low productivity and slow to mature. That doesn't help. But the number of pairs that we have has been increasing. And the number of hatched chicks, that love that trajectory going up. And that red line is still staying below 5. And, just kind of throwing a dart at a dartboard, we would love to see at least 10 wild hatch chicks fledge and live to migrate with their parents every year to get us to that self-sustaining stage. Interesting that little dive in 2018, there was an April snowstorm, which if birds hadn't started nesting yet, that obviously most of the birds abandoned their nest that year, and a lot of birds didn't even bother that year. That was bad. And we've had several other instances of late spring snowstorms. So weather patterns changing. And how is that going to affect all this? I won't even go into that because that is pure speculation, but I can guess. So why are these birds why these chicks not living to fledge? Is it, many meetings, as you can imagine. This is a big partnership to bring these birds back. Lots and lots of meetings trying to figure out, boil it down to something that we can measure and see an outcome and then manage for that and hopefully fix this issue. Famously, black flies. It turns out that Necedah is right next to the Yellow River, which is the epicenter of black flies in central Wisconsin. Has anybody experienced black flies? They are wretched. How about sitting on an egg where you can't leave and you have a brood patch and you have a bald head that's red that is just full of tissue that can be chewed on. It's awful. It's awful. Right. So habitat, is that it, or is it behavior? These are birds that are raised by people, and often people in costume, which is why we're trying to get away from that. But it was a necessity at first, but can we build a better bird? So for behavior, that might be the easiest one to change. We are trying to gravitate away from costume rearing birds and doing more with our captive centers, many more than just the International Crane Foundation, from Calgary Zoo all the way down to Dallas Zoo. Lots of places have captive whooping cranes that are rearing birds for release. The trade-off is that we do not have the numbers. When you costume rear birds, you can get many more to release and put out into the flyway. We might be building a better bird if we have real whooping cranes raise them, but the numbers are much lower. So that's the trade-off there. But it also is going to take a long time to measure this because again, we put the chicks out there. It'll take 4 or 5 years for them to even start to nest. And hopefully, you know, within 10 years, we might know if those are indeed better parents, if they have then, you know, paired with another wild hatch chick or another parent reared bird. You get the difficulty. For an impatient person, this is a very drawn out process. Hard to wait. Habitat is much more difficult. So this map that you can't see from way back there is what our best guess is for the historic nesting range pre-European settlement for the whooping crane. And basically the stronghold was Aspen Parklands down into the Prairie Pothole region through Minnesota down into Iowa. So you think where the core of that breeding area was. Well, right now, the only model that we have, this is what Aransas wood buffalo looks like. This is the Prairie Pothole region. Wisconsin's decidedly not like either one of those. And even if there were an abundance of cranes that were nesting in Wisconsin prior to this, the landscape looks nothing like it did then. So we have to do the best that we can with what we have. So we can manage for black flies, and we are doing that in various ways. There are some times that we can manage habitat, but usually only in federal lands. NCETA doing some clearing to make sure that there aren't brushing areas and things like that. But these birds are finding private lands and little tiny wetlands to nest in. And so when we just have to hope that they make a go of it. So still waiting to see if habitat is the deciding factor. Overall, so back to both of these species, there's a lot of threats continent-wide, you know, and they range from everything from climate change, changing the water levels in a lot of these places, you know, this is the playas in North Texas, where a lot of those central flyway sandhills, they might go away. We have infrastructure issues. Have been talking a lot about solar farms. Solar farms are directly taking some of that agricultural areas that these birds need to forage in. But there are also a lot of power lines that come out of those, you know, taking that power to us someplace that are a risk to them. Of course, that's Florida. Cranes will figure out, you know, like that. I've been here for a long time, and suddenly bloop, there's a neighborhood around me, and they stay. So there's issues there, and of course, poaching. But I'll get to that. So we do applied research in a couple of these areas. So we work with power companies to try to do siting, and if there is no way around it, this is a power line along Interstate 9094 right next to the Crane Foundation. The Wisconsin River and the shack is over on this side. Crane Foundation is just over there, and there's some birds that are flying over twice a day, every day for months in the fall during the staging. And so we were able to meet with this power company and with all of the stakeholders in this area, state, federal, private. And they agreed to put these, forgot, it was a video. And these are the birds. Unfortunately, the highway noise that's too much. Too much for now. They agreed to lower the tower. So often the tower height is at the level of the trees, which adds added protection, but it also puts the lines in horizontal rather than that vertical that is more like a wall that would be a bigger risk for them. But even more importantly, they agreed ahead of time to mark the lines. So they put pigtails and this little flapper that has both a, unfortunately, I'm going to enter the scene here pretty quick. It has glow in the dark and reflective. So even though cranes mostly fly during the day, this area is prone to fog, of course, in September. And I just about tripped over that. This is Thanksgiving Day. It was a glorious, glorious morning. I'm putting up a video camera to see if this line was put up and these birds had, all of a sudden they showed up on their migration one day and there was this thing in space. And so I was trying to see if I could, with all of this video data, kind of get an idea of how these birds reacted to this thing that was now in their airspace. And if I could figure out how to measure that, I will get to that. But basically, if we can estimate mortality from power lines, we can propose ways to mitigate this so that there is no net loss and propose that to these companies. Sandhill populations probably are not at risk population level wise from collision deaths, but other crane species in other areas definitely are. Back to quiet. Crop damage. Oh, I don't know where there's supposed to be the word crop damage up there. Sandhills on the upper Midwest are famous for going through cornfields and plucking out corn seeds. And one thing that's when I started as an intern, this was the project that I was working on. So we helped field test the chemical Avapel, which is very, very effective. It's a seed coating. It takes that one thing off of the menu. It's easier to take that off the menu than to try to tell cranes that you can't be here. They want to be there. And you can see the effectiveness. You can tell where the treated and where the control was in this particular test field. And there was a lot of crane pressure because we could measure that as well. So now the issue is how to get farmers to use it. It costs money. It sometimes costs a lot of money. And so we're trying to figure out ways that all of us that are not farmers but appreciate these birds, that appreciate the comeback of these birds, can share in that cost, because they would prefer them to be hunted, them to be not there. And then they can get money, and that will not solve the crop damage problem at all. So we'd much rather they have a real solution to that. All right, here we are, poaching. This is from a chapter in a Whooping Crane book. So it was updated recently, but this is based on decades worth of documented known gunshot deaths of whooping cranes. And these are the ones that we found. So you can see that as these migratory, these reintroduced populations, both non-migratory and migratory populations, started to come online, a lot more poaching incidents. Especially, this is Louisiana non-migratory, Florida non-migratory, the Eastern migratory, and then Aransas wood buffalo. Missing from this is there were 4 whooping cranes that were taken in one incident in Oklahoma. It's several years ago now, and we have not heard a thing, which actually is probably good news, which means that they know who did it and they're working their way through the issue. But that was 4 birds in that population taken at once. It is really hard on the Louisiana non-migratory population in particular, because it is new. There's a lower number of birds, but a higher proportion of those birds that have been shot. So we have developed a program. Well, I'll talk about that in a second, but they're hunter related. They are decidedly not hunter related. These are acts of vandalism, purposefully going out and shooting these birds. There have been a couple of times where there have been incidents of shooting whooping cranes when someone has been in a hunting situation, but it's either they were in a closed area or maybe outside of shooting hours. So it's still technically not legal, but they were hunters. And quite a few of those, they have turned themselves in when they realized what they did. So again, that is a big difference. There was obviously no malice involved in that. So to that end, we have developed a program specifically looking into that. And the newest one is in Louisiana. We have a staff down in Louisiana that is looking into that. And Caitlin, where's Caitlin? Caitlin is our Indiana outreach staff. She is based here and is running our program here. And so it's really this outreach is getting into communities. It's building awareness, letting people know that they even have whooping cranes here. It's not a white sandhill. Oh, there's thousands of sandhills. They could do without a couple of those. There are white sandhills and they're actually rarer than whooping cranes. But it's building that community awareness and community pride and trying to edge these poachers out. So there's a lot of work that we're doing. And here in Indiana, partnering with Purdue University on a social science project. And so doing a lot of interviews and surveys, you know, what is your level of awareness now? And then going out and doing these programs and coming up with these kind of things, which we have here today, that we'd love to talk with you more about, and you can take some. To see what that change in attitude was. Well, unfortunately, the initial social science project was done in 2019-ish. And so with the pandemic, we were not able to go out and do nearly as much community work as we wanted or needed to do. But Hoosiers for Whoopers, Hoopers, we can discuss how to pronounce that too. But it's you know, there's lots of materials that we can do and we can go out into these areas. And this one in particular, we have these in many crane areas and we actually use them around the world. Is, you know, people love to go out and see these things, but sometimes they are not they're not nice about it. You know, trespassing issues, you know, people don't want these birds around because people are traipsing all over their land and doing other things that are not good. So we have these signs for landowners to try to let people know that we appreciate that the birds are here, but behave, just behave. So never assume that we know that there's a whooping crane around. Always report any banded bird. There's lots of banded sandhills that come through here as well. And so here's something on our website that we report whooping cranes to the county level. And some of that is to ensure that maybe we don't want to be too precise about where these birds are to keep people from doing nefarious things. But again, if you hear that there's whooping cranes in Greene County, where are you going to assume that they are? So, I mean, but that's a protected area. So, you know, I'm okay with people knowing that there are indeed 15, maybe more whooping cranes at Goose Pond. And we do the same with sandhills. So you can find out where there are sandhills, a sandhill finder. And this is drawing from a lot of eBird data. So again, so this is several months after when the annual count would be. It's sponsored by the Fish and Wildlife Service. So you can see how these birds have moved now into these more southern areas. So we will be at the Marsh Madness Crane Festival. So please come down and see lots and lots of cranes there this March, end of February, goodness. So ending on a good note, and there's an asterisk with that. Again, this is there's 4 reintroductions and none of them have been successful. Successful meaning they have not able to make a self-sustaining population. But, you know, this number is a damn sight better than 15. Right? So that's good. And even if this one doesn't work, which I am not even going to go, I am absolutely not going to say that we're still a work in progress but we're learning a lot. If nothing else, we learn how these birds are using our landscape and we learn a lot about reintroduction science. This picture is from Indiana. They are fantastic. If anybody follows the Crane Foundation on Facebook, there's a video up currently of, oh gosh, there's more than 10 birds in the frame and they're all, you know, jockeying around and yapping at each other. And it's really pretty fantastic to see that many whooping cranes in one place at one time. So thank you. Thank you for letting me go on and on about cranes. I just scratched the surface. No joke. But you know what? This is what we like to see. And this is what you have in Indiana, just as a matter of course. And that is fantastic. So please come and visit us in the International Crane Foundation. We're up in Baraboo, Wisconsin. We are celebrating our 50th anniversary this year. So we open May 1st. We're open through October 31st. We have a lot of more special events going on throughout the year, but if you happen to be vacationing or if you make us your vacation destination, we would love to show you the cranes of the world, our great restored prairie. And again, the Leopold Shack is right down the road. And so you can make it a twofer, and you can visit the Circus World Museum too, if you've a mind to do that. We are Clown Town. It's a gorgeous area. Devil's Lake State Park is almost within the city limits too, which is a gorgeous, gorgeous place. I could go on and on. I would love to answer your questions if you have any. Thank you. Yes.
Your slide that showed the number of chicks that hatched and fledged and everything.
Mhm.
Well, you had that one dip on that 1 year on the number of low hatch level. That also, that same year was the peak for the number of fledged chicks.
Yes.
How can you explain that?
Can't. But thank you, because I look at that and I'm just like, wow, what was it that year? That was just a happy accident. But yeah, that was the highest. I believe there was 6 chicks that fledged. Unfortunately, only 5 migrated, but still. And most of those birds are actually alive today. And I don't know why that particular year, but it was great. Yeah. Correct. Yep. North Georgia. Yeah. Almost to Tennessee. It certainly is climate in that there is, as long as there's open water and it's not snow covered, they can find forage. But it also has to be a factor of the growing population. They can't physically all go to the Gulf Coast anymore. And so how that kind of behavior is learned, I don't know. But so there's some with the population growing, and there's some that there is plenty of places in more northern latitudes that they can overwinter. Yeah.
When you guys are tagging the bird, are you satellite tagging or is it all free?
We do both. So depending on the question, right in the beginning, all the whooping cranes have to be marked. If they are a released, captive reared release bird, they have to be marked. We try to capture the wild hatch chicks to mark them as well. And this is part of the permitting from the Fish and Wildlife Service to keep them separate from the Aransas wood buffalo population. A subset of them get satellite transmitters, and it's usually females because they're trying to track them for pairing and nesting. Every single one of them used to get a radio transmitter, so we could follow them on migration. We could intervene if necessary, if they found themselves in a sketchy area, and they have found the most sketchy areas. It's amazing, their ability to find themselves in a bad area. It's uncommon, but it does happen. Now we're trying to back away from that. We're trying to be much more targeted about how much, what we use the radio versus satellite telemetry for, but there's still quite a few of them. We try to put them out. Yes.
The major contributor to their low density in the first place.
The whooping cranes. Yeah. That is an often asked question. Pre-European settlement, how many whooping cranes were there? And we don't know, but guess is that they probably were never very numerous, like 10, I've heard the word 10,000. I don't know how they come with that. It's just all of those records that were on that map of the pre-settlement kind of distribution. Missionary records, fur trappers, indigenous people stories, things like that, trying to piece that together. They tend to be less gregarious, more by themselves. So those prairie potholes, one territory around those prairie potholes, whereas the sandhills tend to gravitate more towards those big emergent wetlands, big sedge meadowy kind of thing. So you can have a higher density of sandhills just by default. So just the best that I can say is that there was just something about the whooping crane brain that they just were not as dense They tend to migrate alone still, although that is changing a little bit. But they still tend to migrate by themselves or in family groups. And if, if that's just because there is so few of them, there's, sandhills, they can't get away from, you can't get away from your sandhill cousins. There's just no way to do it. So that's kind of harder to tease. Yeah. So the question was invasive species and is it affecting nesting? Doing helicopter nest surveys for sandhills. And I mean, we have sandhills that are nesting in retention ponds and they make do. So I've seen them nesting in reed canary grass. Fun fact. A colleague that works down for the Florida Fish and Wildlife Commission got called from a person that wanted the sandhill crane that was nesting on their front porch gone. And they had pictures. This poor crane was nesting on the welcome mat and they had gone over to the fake plant over on the side and like pulled some vegetation out. So it's sad and funny, poor thing. I would of course left it. They wanted it gone. So they went and collected it. So sandhills, it really doesn't make a difference invasive species wise. And yeah, Phragmites is something, but so far shrub encroachment, it's not so much invasive species as much as that just the type of vegetation that it is, trying to keep that shrub encroachment out. So there is that area, as long as there is emergent wetland vegetation, they can make a nest and there's water, they can make a go of it.
The impact of drought on nesting, it's got to be pretty significant, I would think.
It is.
I
And
mean,
that
Especially
led to
the pothole region is what
Yep.
I'm thinking of mostly.
and climatological models say that area of like North Dakota and up into the Prairie Parkland area, that might be wetter going forward. But in Wood Buffalo National Park might be getting drier. So that is something that the big coalition of whooping crane people are talking about, maybe doing more reintroductions in Canada and increasing the number of places where they nest. It doesn't seem to be affecting Wisconsin, but it did affect the Florida population very distinctly. Those birds were not nesting or they suffered higher adult mortality because there was a lack of water for nesting.
And we have a few online questions.
Oh, yeah.
So we have a question from Adrian who would like to know if, I think there was a slide earlier in your presentation that had a picture of an ultralight on it. And you were mentioning phasing those out and they were wondering if perhaps something like drone technology could replace that in the future, or if there's any thought in that direction.
No. I don't like trying to think of how a drone would work for a crane. I mean, it was so the way that the ultralights worked, it was pretty amazing. And the whole goal of the ultralight project was to build the population up enough so that we had a base of adult birds that were migrating on their own to introduce young birds to learn the migration. So yeah, I don't know that drones would work for that, but yeah, we're hopefully phasing all of that kind of artificiality out.
Great. We have a question from Chandra as well, who would like to know a little bit more about the rise of the black fly population and why the cranes aren't able to protect themselves from them.
That is a very interesting question, because the interesting thing about black flies is they are indicative of a really, really healthy stream. That means it is clear, clean, fast flowing stream. And so that's why there's very few places, but where they are, there's a lot of them. But looking back at that map of the historic range of the whooping crane, looking at what the range of this specific species of black fly, because there's an abundance of species and there's very specific ornithophilic bird loving species that where they are, the very specific one that emerges when the birds are nesting, there's a distinct line where they are to the south and where wood buffalo is now to the north. So maybe that's why they never were nesting in any great density, because of black flies. And there is some somebody speculated, which is as good a theory as any, is that is why sandhill cranes, one of the reasons that they might paint their feathers is that that might have some insecticidal qualities in it. Because these black flies will latch onto the feathers, and they have the ones that are bird specific have a little thumb, and they ratchet their way up the feather to the skin. That's how they get to the skin if they don't go right for the head. And so that's interesting. And I don't even know how to test for that, but I hope that answers the question. I think I just brought up a few more questions with that answer.
Yeah, thank you. That's horrifying. Nancy. Nancy would like to know if you could explain a little bit more what you meant by a bad area for some of the nesting birds.
Oh, remind me what my context was.
You had to go rescue some.
Oh, yeah. Well, so in the very beginning of the reintroduction, we actually tracked the birds. They were led by ultralight all the way down to Florida. They would overwinter in Florida, and then they would be free flying. They're on their own, and they did migrate back on their own. But we would follow them, the first few years to make sure that they did indeed know where they were going back to. And one distinct memory I have is that a group of 4 or 5 of them, and it was one of the very first migrations north, they landed in one of the abandoned quarries, like in Chicago, in cities, what I'm talking about. Yeah, that was just like, oh, okay. All of those beautiful forest forks that they have, and they chose an abandoned quarry, but they just stayed overnight and they kept on going, and they were in Wisconsin the next day. Also, they get blown off course, and then we had birds in Ohio up into New York and actually up into Ontario. And at that time, we can't have birds scattered all over the place. And so we made the decision to go and translocate them, go and get in the car and ship them back to Wisconsin. No. So again, those are rare, and there are birds now that are in Michigan, and we decided to not translocate them. But unfortunately, there's a single male and a single female in Michigan. It's like, can't you just find each other or bring a mate back? We'd be happy to have them nest in Michigan. They just need to find themselves. So there's an example of a bad area.
And then last question. I know you're not law enforcement, but do you know if there were any arrests in the 2017 crane poaching in Indiana?
If that is the one that I'm thinking of, no. But I don't know, Callie, do you know anything about that one? That was maybe before your time there. Yeah. Yeah. How sad is it that we can't remember which one that was? But I know that there was one that in Indiana, they knew who it was. And the rumor mill, they probably knew who it was, but nobody was going to say anything because they were that scared of this person. He was that off. And I thought that's pretty horrible. So yeah, no arrest.
Thank you very much.
We will, so myself and Caitlin, I'm happy. I can talk all day, and I have, about cranes, but we have a lot of material over here, and we can talk at lunch and breaks about cranes and stuff. Thank you so much.
Dan, if you don't mind, I want to make a quick announcement right before you start. If anybody has a question or any comments, our virtual listeners can't hear you unless you're on one of these mics. So just raise your hand and we'll try to get a microphone over to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Aaron. Thanks, Ann. That was great. I hope you guys saw what we saw last night, chatting with Ann. She can talk to you about cranes till you're blue in the face, and you'll still be enjoying it because it's that awesome. It's funny, it takes me back to an earlier time in my life. As Rick mentioned, I kind of started my career at the Smithsonian in the bird department. So that is the soft spot in my heart for wildlife, particularly. One thing that jumped out to me is I remember getting taken in front of the director at one point because I was on the interview and I said captivity, and there was a big, we don't have captive animals, we have animals in human care. So captive are prisoners, human care is things that we're doing good for the world. So it's very funny, but that was a big period there. Little bit of a different environment in DC than it is in the Midwest, and I think that's a good thing. So one thing I want to make sure everyone is very well aware of, Ray has done an amazing job, as he always does, organizing our silent auction. If you have not looked at it, all you need to do is take your phone, assuming you have a smartphone, which I hope you all do, scan this little picture right here, and it will take you right to the website. There are some really, really amazing items. They will be open, most of them until 3 o'clock, some of them until 12 o'clock. So find something on there, bid on it. It all goes to a good cause, and that's this place. I want to thank our sponsors as well. We have some of them in the house. So again, they are recognized throughout, but I want to thank Cluj, Sadly, Rachel, and Braun for being a sponsor year in, year out. We couldn't do it without you guys. Thank you so much. Central Indiana Land Trust is also in the house. Thank you guys for coming back as sponsors. Who else is in the house? Charitable Allies is here. Quentin, I don't see you. Are you still outside checking people in? Charitable Allies is new this year, but we want to thank them, of course. And who else? Well, Bose, Lindsay, thank you. A new sponsor this year. We appreciate you guys coming in. And then Drew, who you guys will hear from later, is a representative of National Wildlife Federation, who also helps make this happen. So thank you guys very, very much. Are they in the house? So yeah, yes. And then all the sponsors, it means nothing that you're not here. We appreciate you guys being here, but this conference doesn't happen without our sponsors, and we are really, really thankful to all of you, more than we can say. So one quick housekeeping note is, as you guys leave, you have a name tag. If you could please either leave the entire thing, but definitely the plastic insert or the plastic shell in the little tote out at the registration desk. We will recollect those and use them again in the future. So please don't walk with those. If you want to keep your name, you're more than welcome to do that. We don't necessarily need that. And we have some door prizes. These hats up here, let me grab one. I will not. But this is really a collaborative effort. The man who designed it, again, right there, Drew, is the brainchild behind this really cool looking hat. And it is, it's a hat that talks about one of the big problems we have in this part of the country, and it's invasive carp. So Drew and NWF work a lot on that, but so does this man right here, John Goss, who is on our board. I love to say this, he probably gets annoyed, but he was the Asian carp czar. He is the Asian carp czar. So this is, it's a big deal. Invasive carp can wreak havoc on an ecosystem. There's a lot of work going into it. The big effort is to keep them out of the Great Lakes. So we had hoped to serve you guys some kopi. That is what we want to call it now. Today, it's a delicious fish. We weren't able to make it happen, but we're going to keep working on it. So come back next year, and hopefully we will have kopi on the menu next year for you guys to try. But without further ado, we randomly generated 5 names for hats. So if you are here, you get a hat. If you're not here and I call your name, we'll have to figure out if we're just going to call on somebody else or hold it for you. So Kathleen Donnelly. No. Okay. Carol Ford. She's virtual. Ask Carol if she wants a hat. We'll hold it for her. Okay. Carol gets a hat. Kate Nielsen. Man. Does Kathleen want a hat? Yes. Okay. Is Kate Nielsen online? Amy Perry? Amber Slaughterback? You can give it to her. Pull more. Okay, so we will continue this later. I think, am I forgetting any announcements that I need to be making right now? We are going to go into a short break. And then you will hear some more talks. I believe Callie, you are next. So continuing the water and crane theme of this, Callie will talk to you guys about Goose Pond, which if you haven't been, what are you doing? It's awesome. You need to get down there. He has a friend who's a pretty avid bird watcher and had never been to Goose Pond because their thinking about the property was it's for hunting. It is for hunting. It's also for bird watching. And if you don't go there, you're crazy. It's really, really magnificent. And I think one of the things I'm so intrigued with IWF and as an organization is exactly that dichotomy. Bird watchers and hunters shouldn't be in opposition to each other. They should be united because as one benefits, the other is going to benefit, right? One of our great partner organizations is Ducks Unlimited. It's a hunting organization. It's also one of the premier conservation organizations in this country. They're not mutually exclusive. And I think oftentimes we as a society have lost sight of that. And we need to get back to putting our differences aside and focusing on those things that we agree on. And again, in the hunter and bird watcher world, there's a lot more in common than there is that is in opposition. And I think Callie can talk about that as well as anyone I know. So if take an opportunity to chat with her following her talk, because she's a wealth of knowledge, just like Ann, and you guys are going to be in a treat with this presentation as well. So Callie.
All right. I'm Callie Dunn. I'm the property manager for Goose Pond Fish and Wildlife Area, and I'm going to talk to you guys today about Goose Pond Fish and Wildlife Area. So you already saw my bio, a little bit about me. I've been property manager at Goose Pond since April of 2021. I began my career with the Division of Fish and Wildlife in 2017 as the assistant manager at Glendale Fish and Wildlife Area. I earned my bachelor's degree in wildlife in 2015 from Purdue University. And then I went in and got a master's degree in forestry in 2018. I completed a thesis on the invasive Callery or the Bradford pear trees on Crane Naval Depot. So that was a really cool experience in Southern Indiana. I've got 3 boys and I spend my spare time, spending time with them, going out on the property. And overall, I'm just really passionate about high quality wildlife habitat and everything that goes into that. And my particular favorite is prescribed fire. So let's see. Did that go right? Okay. Yeah. Goose Pond Fish and Wildlife is a fish and wildlife area managed by the Division of Fish and Wildlife under the Indiana Department of Natural Resources. It's not displaying quite right, but that's all right. As a fish and wildlife area, we are directly funded by the sale of hunting and fishing licenses, and then that is used as a federal match funds for excise taxes on guns and ammo. What that does is it creates a dedicated fund that is specifically for the manage of wildlife habitat and recreational access. These funds cannot be taken or used for anything else. They have to go into wildlife management. So this ensures properties like Goose Pond remain wildlife habitat in perpetuity. In addition to the premium bird watching opportunities that you'll find on Goose Pond, the property also provides excellent waterfowl and quail hunting to the public. There is no fee to visit Goose Pond Fish and Wildlife Area. This is true of all fish and wildlife areas. We do require that all of our visitors sign in using our miscellaneous use sign in. There's no cost. You take a little brown permit with you on the property. Fill it out when you're done, leave us a comment, let us know what you're doing. What this does is it allows us to understand the diversity of people that are using the property and better serve you. So historically, Goose Pond is an area that was a glacial lake. And if you've been to our visitor center, you can see when you look out over the marsh, it's a depression in the landscape. It looks like a bowl. And that helps you know that it's a natural depression in the landscape. It serves as a reservoir for water. Goose Pond remained as swampland throughout the 1800s. And in 1850, the Swampland Act was passed, which encouraged wetland drainage to convert these landscapes to agriculture. Around the early 1900s, efforts began to convert Goose Pond into this agricultural practices. This was initially known as the Greene County Farm. The area remained in agriculture for the remainder of the 1900s, and at one time was even Indiana's largest cattle farm. All of these efforts were obviously wildly unsuccessful because the wetland habitats at Goose Pond, it wants to be a wetland. There's no way to drain it. So in the 1990s, the Natural Resources Conservation Service put together the Wetland Reserve Program. And this program was aimed at restoring wetlands in Indiana. At one time, there was as much as 40% or more wetlands in Indiana, and now today we have less than 5%. So at this time, then the private landowner of Goose Pond, which was Wilder Farms, enrolled the initial 7,000 acres into this program, which kickstarted the restoration. Restoration of Goose Pond and the Bee Hunter Marshes involved more than 20 miles of tile exploration. And that was to try to remove all those efforts that went in to drain the landscape and let it hold the water that it wanted to. We installed more than 40 miles of levees, and there's more than 30 water control structures on the property. It's really cool. And I like to point out to property visitors when you come out, like Bee Hunter Marsh was the first part of the restoration that was completed. So both Bee Hunter and Goose Pond look similar, but it's almost like Bee Hunter is maybe 2 to 5 years ahead of the rest of the property. It's pretty cool. Part of the restoration involved significant earthwork, and this was to create topography that was beneficial for wildlife that uses wetlands. It's really interesting to me to see how important Goose Pond has been for wildlife, and in such a short span of time, truthfully. The restoration was partially completed in 2005 and fully completed in 2008. And it's not been that long. And the wildlife that is found it is amazing. And it just shows that this is the area is fulfilling an ecological need for wetlands in Indiana and serving wildlife that probably use the area pre-settlement. We just don't know. At the time of the project, this was the largest wetland restoration in the Midwest. And it remains the largest wetland restoration in Indiana. The initial restoration included just over 7,000 acres. Today, Goose Pond is 9,098 acres of wetlands and prairies maintained for wildlife. So this shows you some of the work and initial planning for the property. Today, Goose Pond's an intensively managed early successional wetland habitat. And while wetlands are certainly a huge component of the property, the restoration also included establishing more than 2,000.
I messed up the formatting on her presentation. I'm going to see if it would make sense
No,
to switch it. You're
That's
good?
all right. Just pretend there's like a DNR logo in
There's a
green across
very
the top.
beautiful Swooshy logo.
Yeah. Yeah, just pretend there's a green border at the top and it says DNR, and we'll be good. Okay. So yeah, wetlands are a huge component of the property, of course, but the initial restoration also included 2,000 acres of prairie plantings and 400 acres of tree plantings. And as you can see in the above map, all of the habitat work that went into it. Since the initial restoration, we have also added some wildflower and pollinator plantings on different parts of the property. We've also added the Thousand Islands unit, which is just to the right on the north side there. So that was a significant habitat added to the property. And we continue to manage these initial plantings as well as the ones that we put in to reduce woody encroachment, which would be like shrubs and trees coming in, trying to take over that high quality grassland. The microtopography that you see on here is referring to some of the dirt work that was done in the units to create the variation in water levels within the units. The variation is really important for creating a mosaic of diverse habitats close together, so they maximize their benefits to the wildlife, including insects, fish, amphibians, marsh birds, waterfowl, and more. Today, Goose Pond is an ecologically important stopover for many species of migrating shorebirds, marsh birds, and waterfowl. It also provides excellent habitat for northern bobwhites, eastern cottontail rabbits, turkeys, and white-tailed deer. The property is a really popular destination, as you all know, for wildlife watchers and hunters of all flavors, but especially waterfowl hunters. We really strive to balance the resource use at Goose Pond. It is a place for all outdoor enthusiasts. We try to provide a fun place for everybody to visit nature and learn about the natural habitats of Indiana. Annually, Goose Pond sees more than 10,000 visitors. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the habitat management and what goes into keeping Goose Pond, the restoration's done. But there's still a lot of work to be done to keep these habitats valuable. So habitat management at Goose Pond is focused on creating and maintaining those early successional habitats for wildlife. That's grasslands, emergent wetlands, open water, and shrubs, like shrubby grasslands as well. So to do this, we use things like prescribed fire. We manipulate the water levels in our wetlands using those water control structures. We mow with bush hogs and disc with tractors, and we also use a bunch of other disturbance-based habitat management. All of our management activities at Goose Pond are covered under a blanket management plan that we actually file with the Natural Resources Conservation Service. And this is because of that wetland reserve program. That easement that the property was enrolled in by the private landowner will exist forever, regardless of who owns it. So that helps protect the wetland habitat and the restoration that was done there. Not that Fish and Wildlife would ever revert their habitat management. So I write this management plan. I update it every 5 years, as well as, some annual adaptations that meet the property needs that come up with changes in weather or wildlife. So the habitats in Indiana, as you all know, are at Goose Pond are exceedingly important in Indiana because wetlands comprise just 3.5% of our habitats in Indiana. And grasslands are only 15% of habitats in Indiana, which makes this area super valuable. Maintaining these habitat types is very intensive and means we are conducting some form of habitat management all year long. So one of the many ways that we maintain our grassland habitats at Goose Pond is to use tractors with mowers and discs to manipulate the landscape. This resets that habitat to the early conditions. So like grasslands, open ground, low woody cover. Mowing and disking are utilized to enhance other effects of management practices that we'll talk about later. So mowing reduces our cover density. It's just going in there and cutting down the grass. And it allows wildlife to move more freely. Disking is much more intense because we're taking that down to bare dirt. So the effect lasts a little longer. And again, our goal with all of these practices is to reset the area and not eliminate. So we're not trying to get rid of the plants. We're not trying to convert the landscape. It's just taking it back and starting it over. So we mow back prairie grasses and expose the bare dirt with the goal of all of these species growing back. Now, a really common thing I encounter when I talk to people about all these practices is they ask like, why can't you just like let it be, let nature run its course, do its thing? It's really common. And we can't because these habitats undisturbed because the plants will grow so densely that they actually impede wildlife and it will change. The landscapes will change. And that means it changes the wildlife they serve and it becomes useful to different species. And we're trying to serve the ones that want this habitat. Bare ground is also often desirable foraging habitat, as you see by these wild turkeys using this freshly disked block. So in maintaining the open habitats at Goose Pond, we also do just a little bit of rotational farming practices. And I have a tenant farmer and I write up the contract. He uses specified fields. He plants on a specified rotation, what he's supposed to plant, where and when. It's on a 2 to 4 year rotation of planting in succession. So you might plant 2 years in a row and leave the field empty for 2 years, or plant 1 year, leave it, plant another year, leave it again. This allows us to maintain more of the habitats I'm talking about, because when you have so much area that you're trying to do this on, it becomes hard to keep up. Nature never stops. The plants never stop growing. It takes a lot to keep on top of it. So this is another tool in the toolbox that helps us manipulate the landscape and keep the habitats. And also, while not on Goose Pond, I want to mention I manage a grazing contract on another property in Hillenbrand Fish and Wildlife area. It's another property that I manage. We have a tenant. He puts cattle out there from May 15th to August 15th, and the cattle, they stir the soil by walking around. They selectively graze, and it's just a really cool management effect on the property, and it's a really unique disturbance. So finally, we also plant some food plots on the property to provide additional food sources. And one of the most popular food plots that we plant is the sunflower fields. And people go crazy for these. The peak time for sunflower fields on Fish and Wildlife area is late July, because I know somebody's going to ask. So Indiana's native landscape is dependent on a disturbance-based habitat regime. This means that even our forests are dependent on some type of disturbance, whether that be prescribed fire, sustainable timber harvest, or understory plant control in order to continue to be valuable to our native wildlife species. Fire has been part of our landscape for centuries. So to emulate the natural fires that would have occurred in the area of Goose Pond, we conduct prescribed fire on Goose Pond. This is one of the most powerful tools that we use for succession control. It's my goal annually to burn at least 1,500 acres on Goose Pond, because you want to burn, like, these prairie habitats need to be burned every 2 to 3 years. So we try to burn 1,500 acres every year. It helps us maintain the grassland and the open wetland habitats that the property is known for. As I've already mentioned, these habitats are on the decline in Indiana. And fire helps us by reducing the density of plants and grasslands. It also is a big proponent of regenerating wildflowers. It reduces trees and helps us control shrub cover in the area. And it also just improves the necessary cover and food source for native insects in Indiana, which is a huge factor in wildlife use of these habitats. So whenever we conduct prescribed fire, I have a prescribed burn plan. We operate off the burn plan. I usually have my plans in place months in advance. We go through, we put in our fire breaks. I like to use natural fire breaks like the wetlands and roads and disc blocks. And then we go out there when the weather is right and let it go. The picture on the left there was done in Goose Pond 9 in the fall. And that picture just is really cool. I actually got that from somebody. A utility forester saw the smoke in Terre Haute, which is not that close to Goose Pond. We just had a good day with really good smoke dispersion, and he just hopped in his helicopter and came and took a picture and sent it to me. So another piece that goes into maintaining these habitats is the use of herbicides. And when we're talking about wetlands and things, a lot of people don't think that chemicals, but the reality is that herbicide chemicals are indispensable tools in wildlife habitat management. We use a lot of herbicide on the property, in the grasslands, in the wetlands, and even in tree plantings. My assistant manager and I are both licensed pesticide applicators. All the guys that work on my field crew are registered technicians. With the Office of the Indiana State Chemist, we have to do continuing education. I just did a webinar last week. We are very meticulous in our applications. So we use the minimum amount required to get the desired effect, always follow all label instructions, and make sure we're selecting the appropriate surfactants. So in the application, we are often seeking to control both the invasive and the native plants. One of the shifts when I came to Goose Pond from Glendale Fish and Wildlife Area was I don't do as much time just targeting specific invasive species anymore. It's more of a whole ecosystem look at things. So in maintaining the emergent wetlands, you know, there's a bunch of native plants that are really aggressive that are going in to close up that open water or those mud flats, and then that degrades the wildlife habitat. Additionally, we are the depression in the landscape. We are everybody's drainage. So we get lots of seeds come in with the water that comes to the property, and some are good and some are bad. So the big things that we're usually controlling in the wetlands is like Phragmites, which is invasive, American lotus, which is native, and smartweed, which is also native. It's just like a whole picture look at things. So most of the applications we do ourselves. We have like an Argo, we have a Marshmaster, which is like an aquatic vehicle. It's pretty cool. You should look it up. I should have included a picture of that. So we do a lot of the spraying ourselves, but when we're looking at larger areas, we will actually contract out our spraying, and you have an aerial spraying application done. Now, these are always like the big picture applications, and we're usually looking at treating more than 150 acres when we have an aerial spray application come in. The guy that usually takes our contract has a helicopter, and it's a cool sight to see. It just cannot be beat, though, compared to how long it takes us to go out on the ground level and spray things versus him getting out there for 4 hours and spraying 300 acres for us. So there are approximately 4,000 acres of shallow wetlands at Goose Pond Fish and Wildlife Area. The majority of the wetland habitats are maintained in those early stages of the wetlands, so the emergent marshes. And so we implement 3 different water level manipulations at Goose Pond, and they are the emergent, the moist soil, and the fall mud. Our emergent wetland units are maintained at a depth ranging from 1 foot to 4 foot, and sometimes deeper in a few places. And these units have 50% or greater open water, and they usually involve very minimal manipulation. Like we're not going out and setting the level in the structures as much on these ones in a year. We do spring drawdowns, and the goal of these is to reduce the open water and expose those open mud flats in early spring that corresponds with the migration of shorebirds coming through the area. The drawdowns, we complete them by we have boards in our water control structure, and however high those boards are, that's how deep the water is. Most boards are like 6 inches tall. So we pull one board out, the wetland will drop 6 inches. So a lot of times we pull 1 or 2 to drop the wetland 6 inches or a foot, depending on the different unit and what the plants look like around there. And that exposes that mud flat, creates that desirable habitat for the migrants as they come through. And we usually start these beginning in mid-February and draw them out through mid-June. Some occur later in the drawdown period. Some occur later or earlier in that drawdown period, and it's all based on weather and habitat conditions. And so managing these units is definitely way more of an art than it is a scheduled science. I always make a schedule for our drawdowns, and we always deviate from it by the second week because it's just entirely dependent on the weather and what the wildlife response is. So we begin our fall drawdown period in late July or August. And again, this all depends on weather. These have the goal of creating those mud flats for habitat for migrating shorebirds then in the fall as they're coming back through Indiana. This period usually peaks in September. This is a lot trickier to accomplish for us because we want to create the habitat for the migrating shorebird, but we also want to refill our wetlands. And if you have a year like we had in 2022, we had really awesome fall drawdowns because we had a drought. But then when it was time to try to reflood the wetlands, it was very hard. We had like more than 45 days with no rain at one point. It made it a little difficult. Yeah. And I mentioned, our water, we have water control structures on the property, so we can let out water all day, but this is our biggest limitation is that when we go to fill our units, because we are entirely dependent on that rainfall. Yeah, so again, this year was not good for that. Next year, hopefully it'll be better. And then the flip side of that too is like when we have flooding conditions, we lose some of that control too, because water can backflow from our ditches and creeks and into the units, and that can compromise what we're trying to accomplish and our goals. You just cannot control nature. A really unique habitat feature that we have at Goose Pond is we have a least tern nesting island, specifically managed to provide nesting habitat for migrating least terns. And this period usually begins mid-May through July. The island is located in the main pole unit of the southern part of the property and consists of a river rock surface surrounded by fencing, which we electrify during the nesting season to protect nesting and newly hatched least terns. The 22 nesting season produced 10 fledged terns, which is really cool. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it's when you have a small population, that's really significant. Maintenance of this island includes going out and applying herbicide to get rid of plants, raking the gravel to create that smooth surface. Some of the times of the freeze and thaw throughout the winter can disrupt the smoothish surface. And then we will place least tern decoys and game cameras out there to try to entice the terns as they're coming through to land on the island and nest there, and then game cameras to observe them and see what's going on. When they nest successfully, we will put in shelters over the nests to try to protect them from predators, because predators is the big thing. And they are monitored until the last fledgling leaves the property. Yeah, the nesting success of these least terns is really dependent on the presence of these islands being these like smooth gravel surfaces and minimal disturbance. So the lack of undisturbed nesting habitats has been a really big contributing factor to decline of least terns. So if you come to look at the property, you'll see we put up signs all around the tern nesting island at that period to keep people away. So observe from a distance. So the wildlife response to the habitat resource present on Goose Pond has been astounding. Since the restoration has been completed, the property has become an important stopover habitat for many species of migrating waterfowl, shorebirds, and marsh birds, and even owls. Our migration season kicks off in early fall, late summer with the arrival of migrating shorebirds, which makes use of our drawn down wetland units and continues through March or April. As season progresses, we begin accumulating blue-winged teal, then a variety of duck species, and finally in January, we start to see the arrival of snow geese and white-fronted geese. Because of the abundance of migrants during this time, this is the peak time for property visits. So aside from the migrating shorebirds and waterfowl, sandhill and whooping cranes are also popular property visitors. They begin arriving typically early November with peak numbers occurring like now. So the end of January through the end of February is when we see the peaks in those. Goose Pond is really important for these species. And this week we have about 7,000 sandhill cranes. And the last count on whooping cranes was about 15 on and around the property. So yeah. Okay. We also, our property features a modern and accessible visitor center. It is a birdability site, which overlooks the property and is staffed 7 days a week for visitors to talk to the naturalist about the property and wildlife that use it. In addition, we do host a variety of interpretive programs throughout the year and have 2 interpretive naturalists on staff. Some fun events we have hosted include Scale Scutes and Skins, which is focused on amphibians and reptiles, a summer kayak outing, we learned to hunt courses, learned a frog gig event, which is super fun, an owl prowl, and much more. All of these events are meant to engage participants and connect everybody with the nature around them. These events see many local participants as well as visitors who come from as far as 2 hours away. And it's just one way in which we seek to serve the community and help everyone find the different activities they can do at Goose Pond. And then on February 25th, we're going to have our annual Marsh Madness Festival in Linton. It'll be at the park in Linton and at the property. And we're also going to have a dedication to the interpretive trail that was completed in partnership with the Indiana Wildlife Federation. So Goose Pond is unique and wonderful habitat for wildlife in Indiana. And I encourage you all to come out and visit us sometime. Anybody have any questions? Yes. Yep. Is that the microphone?
Have you ever considered using beaver to manage the wetlands?
So the beaver work against us more than they work with us. So they very consistently they hear that running water and they just cannot stand it. So they shove sticks and all kinds of mud and muck into our water control structures. So sometimes it helps, sometimes it hurts.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you go ahead.
Okay, so I know that there's a population of state endangered northern crawfish frogs on the property. Do you guys avoid using herbicides on habitat where they're located?
So the crawfish frogs are actually more concentrated at Hillenbrand Fish and Wildlife area, which is just north of Linton. And that is the area actually where we have our grazing contract. And the reason we have that there is because we're trying to not disc and disturb the soil in that way and disrupt them. The crawfish frogs on Goose Pond, they're there, but they have limited nesting success. Or nesting. They don't do very well on hatching tadpoles and things and surviving because of the flooding variations. It brings in fish that come in and predate on them and eat them. So in the areas that we don't necessarily avoid using herbicide in those areas. We time it appropriately to avoid interacting with them. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay.
You had mentioned predator control. I'm sure that's a big issue there as well, complex as well. What sort of predators and what, elaborate on the program of the predator control that you use?
So we don't necessarily do any predator control as an agency on Goose Pond Fish and Wildlife area. Major predators on the property would be like coyotes, bobcats, sometimes mink will predate on things, but as part of the natural system, there is hunting for coyotes and trapping for coyotes and muskrats, mink, all those things allowed on the property. Yes. Yep.
Curious about quail and upland game birds and
Mhm.
the property, the survey, what is it working? Are they growing? What's the status of those species?
Yeah, so northern bob whites really need about, really need about 10,000 acres to really grow and continue their population. The population on Goose Pond is relatively stable. We do fall covey counts every year and spring whistle counts on the property. This helps us understand what our population looks like. Then we use like our fall covey counts is what we use to determine harvest quotas on the property. So the property is divided into 5 upland game hunting units. You can only hunt on days that we draw, which is Wednesdays and Saturdays. And once a harvest quota is met on those quail in that unit, it's shut down for quail hunting then is rabbit only. On top of that, the University of Georgia is actually active on the property. They're doing a research study on the bobwhite quail population. There's no grouse. Grouse is considered extirpated in Indiana, though you'll hear mixed reports of 1 or 2, but usually that's more in the eastern side of the state.
So I have a question on the snow geese, 2-part question, I guess.
Okay.
One, this huge massive snow geese, about how many do you think are there at the max?
Oh, man.
And what do they eat and how do they find enough to eat with that many birds in one place?
So we've had numbers of 30 to 40,000 snow geese in the last few weeks on Goose Pond. And it's like dizzying to look at that many snow geese. They are on the property. They'll eat like a variety of plants, and you can tell when they've been in an area and loafing because they do a little succession control for us, and they'll eat all kinds of grass and crops and things like that. Or we find a lot of times they'll like roost on the wetlands, eat grass there, then go to some of the egg fields that are ours and around us and eat like refuse grain and things that are left in those areas.
I have a couple questions from our virtual crowd. First, Adrian would like to know if hunting and bird watching take place at the same time, and how do you schedule that?
Yeah, they do occur at the same time. And what we do is we do all of our waterfowl hunting by draw only. So we draw, Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Saturday, and then we rotate the units that are hunted every day. So that way there's a set schedule and people can kind of identify how to work around each other because everybody has equal access on the property. Yeah.
Just play nice with each other.
Yeah.
And then Nancy would like to know if before you do a burn, do you walk ahead to look for any wildlife that might be in the area that could be removed, like turtles and slow moving wildlife?
Well, I always check our burn breaks before we start the burn and throughout the burn. But what you'll find with wildlife is they know what's up and they get out of there pretty quickly. And a lot of times the timing of our burns, we don't have too many issues coming across turtles or things like that and burning them up.
You mentioned doing herbicide from a helicopter.
Yeah.
Are there any concerns about drift, and how is that managed?
So the way we manage drift and other applications, so we will close down the areas that we do aerial application in on the day of, and we also keep them closed until a set reentry period. All your herbicides have on the label a set reentry period, which means like nobody should be walking through it at this time. So we close down those areas, and then the issues of drift, we don't apply if the wind or vaporization is going to be a problem to take that chemical offsite and impact other habitats aside from where we want it.
Amber would like to know if you have any issues with invasives popping up when you do drawdowns and you have the mud flats.
Yes and no. Most of the invasives are pretty much already there. I have not had any new ones introduced. It's just like the ongoing battles of Phragmites and reed canary grass.
And then last, Tim just wants to know if you could elaborate on how visitor use is tracked.
So all property visitors are supposed to sign in, and that's whether you are bird watching, wildlife watching, taking a walk, or hunting or fishing. So everybody is supposed to sign in at a self-service booth or at a visitor center. You take a card that corresponds to what your activity is, keep it with you on the property, fill it out, and drop it back in a drop box. We go through those cards every week. We do read every comment and everything, and that's how we track our use.
Do you partner with sporting groups like Ducks Unlimited?
Yes, so we will do partner events, outreach, and things like that. We're always up for collaborative projects. Anyone else? All right. Thank you.
Okay, I think we are going to take advantage of this windfall in time. We're about 6 minutes ahead of schedule and we're just going to plow through to get you guys to lunch. So it's obvious I was not part of the planning team initially because I get the before and the after lunch slot. So I guess that's, yeah, well, I'll do my best to not keep you guys from eating and wake you up after lunch. Okay, that's me. That's again, former life. So one thing I was thinking about both during Ann and Callie's talks were, and if it's not apparent, sarcasm will be heavy in this. One of the benefits to killing all our charismatic megafauna in the state is that we have to focus on birds, which is my wheelhouse and I'm excited about. But one of the coolest experiences I ever had, which is this picture, was while at the Smithsonian, I was given the opportunity to go do seal research down in Antarctica. And that is a much younger version of me. I'd probably break in half if I tried to do this today. That's a Weddell seal, female. It is a seal that only breeds in Antarctica on the fast ice. So that's your ice that's attached to the land. And they will weigh 1,600 pounds just before they birth a pup. And by the time they are done raising that pup, about 3.5 months later, they weigh 800 pounds. It's a pretty impressive weight loss regime. So they are absolutely incredible creatures. And as you'd expect in Antarctica, they're subject to climate change, which is something that is pervasive in all these conversations we've been having here today. There are some winners in it and there's a lot of losers in it, but something that, as we've been talking about birds a lot here, that is going to be really interesting in the coming years, decades, is birds aren't dumb, especially these migratory ones. They don't want to go further than they need to go. And as our climate warms, you can see it right now. There's not as much ice. There's not as much snow. Indiana is becoming kind of ground zero for southbound migration for a lot of these animals. And we're seeing numbers pick up. So places like Goose Pond, places like Jasper Pulaski, Kankakee, all of our bodies of water are going to become even more laden with these waterfowl at this time of year. So that's going to be a really, I think, interesting change and something that hopefully Indiana can be on the front end by creating more of this habitat to really take advantage of this abundance of animals. It's one of those old cliches, if you build it, they will come. I think in this case, it's really true. So that was not what I was supposed to be talking about, but it was something that popped in my head. So I apologize. So many of you probably know Jenny Blake, who was our Sustainable Trails Coordinator. Jenny got a great opportunity to go work for the park district in and around Katiwi. She's managing the campground there. It's awesome. She is I think I'm allowed to say this. She is going through some life changes. She's pregnant. And it was just a great opportunity for her. So Aaron and I particularly are very sad to have her go. And I'm sorry for you guys, but instead of getting Jenny to talk to you, I'm going to talk about Sustainable Trails and what IWF does with them. Callie has referenced this. One of the trails we have worked on is at Goose Pond. And we're going to open it up in February for Marsh Madness. So check it out. It's a really cool trail. And you may get this throughout. I really like QR codes, so I sprinkle them in as I can. All you need to do is take a picture of that and it'll take you right to our Sustainable Trails program. And I'm not going to bore you guys by reading everything that's up there. If you care about learning more about Sustainable Trails, scan that QR code. You'll go straight to our brochure that has about 15 pages that explains this much more in depth than what I'm going to do now. So our Sustainable Trails program has 4 major goals: to promote conservation and enhance the wildlife habitats surrounding the area, right? One of our goals here is to get people outdoors, to utilize the outdoors. but we don't want to do that to the detriment of wildlife, right? We are the Indiana Wildlife Organization. That's our priority. So we have to keep sometimes these counteracting things in check and balance them out. Provide the 4 main components of a good habitat, and that's pretty self-explanatory. They're the same thing we need for a good habitat. You need food, you need water, you need shelter, and you need a place to raise the next generation. As you heard, particularly in Ann's talk, that's pretty challenging part of these adults. They're pretty good at living. The young ones, not so much. So having really good breeding and rearing habitat is important. To preserve and also enhance the diversity of wildlife and native plants in the area. So a big part of this is removing invasive plants. You'll hear that amongst everybody. It didn't used to be the focus of so many of these conservation programs, but it's really the bedrock of what this is all built on. So without healthy plant ecosystems, you're not doing anything beneficial. So get rid of the bad, put in the good, and let nature do what it does. And as Callie said, sometimes you have to manage it. Fire, something that a lot of us are afraid of for obvious reasons. When done well, it is maybe the most important tool in our toolkit for these landscapes. And then to create environmentally friendly experiences for people. We want people to go out and use these trails, but not end there. We want them to be struck by it and to take that home with them and then become an advocate for everything that we are promoting outside of just our trail program. So here's a map of our state. And all of those stars you see there are our sustainable trails, either completed and in use, or in the case of the yellow ones, those are ones that are nearly complete. And the red one I'll get into is our most ambitious one, and one we are just starting to really dig into. And you can see they're kind of all over the state. There is a pointer on this if I'm smart enough to figure out how to use it. Green. Yeah, I took. Where? Thanks, Ann. Yep. So you can see all the way. Okay, all the way up north, Michigan City. This is a really cool one. This is actually in a development, but it was a development where they took habitat into account and actually wanted to preserve the integrity of the area there, all the way down south. This is also a really unique one. This is an archaeological site that we have a trail in. And then Goose Pond is right there. You can see there's a cluster in and around Indianapolis. And this is one that I will talk about shortly as well. So within Indy, you can see we have a variety of them. The Urban Wilderness Trail is something that you wouldn't think as a really, really neat trail. It is right through the White River and Fall Creek convergence. It is, if some of you in the room know a guy named Coach Harger, Greg Harger, he is a trainer of world-class long distance runners who really was just running through this brambly, awful area along the river, and partnered through Row, through Friends of the White River, a variety of organizations, and us to clean this trail out and turn it into a trail that actually goes to some pretty cool habitat. It's the only place in Indiana I've ever seen a least weasel. So right in the middle of the city. Go check it out. There's still a fair amount of invasive material in there, a lot of honeysuckles you'd expect, but it's really starting to turn into something special. And again, right in our urban core of the city. Okay, so this is one that I mentioned earlier. This was the red dot or the red star on the map. This is a trail that we received a very generous grant through the state, the governor's Next Level Trails program, in conjunction with Central Indiana Land Trust, who is the property owner of Bentley Woods at Glacier's End. So Trafalgar and Johnson County, there it is on the map. So kind of south of Indianapolis. It's called Glacier's End, and sometimes names make sense. This is where the Wisconsin Glacier terminated its southward migration. So literally on this property, you have terrain that was glaciated and unglaciated. And even someone like me can walk in, look at it, and understand those differences. It's really, really, really cool. It's a stunning property, a lot of unique features in Indiana, particularly in this area. It's kind of the entryway into Brown County. Everyone knows Brown County State Park. It's beautiful. This is like Brown County without a million people. It's really awesome. So this is a picture of the woods, and it's home to a lot of really cool species: northern long-eared bats, red-shouldered hawks, hooded warblers, and the aptly named timid sedge. So these are things you're not going to find in very many places, and they're there. And this has all been taken into account as we plan this trail. Again, as I said, we want to bring people into places, but we don't want to do that to the detriment of our wildlife. As I said, it was made possible through the mayor's Next Level Trails program. And I'll throw a little pitch here. Reach out to your elected officials in the state and tell them to please support the governor's proposed budget. It's really, really, really strong from our standpoint. Did we want more? Of course, we're greedy, but he really put forth a strong budget that takes conservation into account. So take this time, reach out to your elected officials and ask them to support the governor's budget, because it will be a game changer for the way we do things in this state. There are going to be 3, maybe 4, we're not yet sure, distinct loops on this property. One of them you can see here. Now I can do the yellow thing. Thanks. Or I can do that pointer. Thanks. That yellow one is going to be an accessible trail loop. It's going to be something that anyone can go out and walk on. It's going to be crushed limestone. It's going to be flat. We're not sure if it's going to be officially ADA accessible, but it's going to be right at that borderline. It's a pretty topographically interesting property. So keeping your slopes within the guidelines is going to be challenging. We're doing everything we can. If not, it's going to be as close as you can be to ADA accessible without actually being so. The other loops are going to be really special. Big soaring up hills, bridges crossing canyons. You're going to have probably some opportunities to skedaddle across little rocks that are set up as a bridge, not a continuous bridge. It's going to take some effort, but you're going to be able to like jump from pylon to pylon to get across these rivers. We think it's going to be a really, really special place. So Stacy is here, and she probably hears this from Cliff more than anyone. Cliff Chapman, who is the head of Silty, has big ideas for things. And one of the things he challenged us with is this needs to be an Instagrammable place, right? So I barely know what Instagram is, but I know that you see people out there with their phones like this. That's what we're after. We're going to have these places where you go, you take a picture, and all your friends are going to be like, I want to go there. And I think we will be able to accomplish that with this property. As I said, it's a team effort. It's the state, it's us, it's Silty. And then we were so lucky, for those of you guys who hike trails in the state, you may know Alex Stewart. He is the owner of Spectrum Trail Design. They're as good as it gets, not only in Indiana, but certainly in the Midwest, maybe the country. He's done stuff up in Michigan and Ohio, all over the country, in national parks. He's awesome. He is building this trail for us, and it's going to be the best. This is kind of us out there scoping it out. And this has been a really fun process. We go down to this property, we walk around. They're out there with these instruments I don't understand, getting slopes of land and all sorts of things. Because again, we want this to be sustainable. We don't want it. It's going to be sustainable. And it's going to be sustainable from a wildlife standpoint, but also from a maintenance standpoint. We don't want to be in there every 2 years regrading erosion to replace wooden infrastructure that's rotted out. So all that's being taken into mind. We want to build it and forget it for, as we said on this walk, till all of us are long gone. Another sustainable trail, which Callie referenced in hers, is one we're building in Goose Pond, or built in Goose Pond. I don't know if we say building or built because it's not officially open yet, but it's done. So you guys know where it is based on her talk. And it was done, again, IWF and Friends of Goose Pond got the money together to do this trail. It is a really special place. This is when we were down there. This is why you need to go down there. These are just snow geese going up and down and up and down. And it's a sight to behold. When I lived in DC, we'd go out to a national wildlife refuge called Bombay Hook. They had 85 to 100,000 of these things out there. But what, Callie, how many is that? 12,000 maybe? It's a lot. And you really can't tell much difference between 12 and 80,000. It's a lot of birds up in the air. So I was lucky enough to come in at the back end of this. I didn't have to deal with all the headaches of dealing with a state entity, trying to make sure that everything was how they wanted it. The engineers in the room understand that. But it's a trail that was thoughtfully done. Again, we want these trails to be usable by everybody. We want people to get out there regardless of their physical abilities, because everyone deserves a right to be in these outdoor spaces. This was the actual construction. You can see big equipment. This is not something we're gonna be doing in Bentley's Woods or Bentley Glaciers and at Bentley's Woods because the topography is too much there. So when you can, this is helpful. When you can't, you make do. That is the visitor center. And again, I want to promote this visitor center. It is so cool. One of the things that really got me excited was they used a special glass in the construction of it. So this nature center is designed that you can bird watch from it. You can just look out the glass. Glass is great for looking out like that. It's a beautiful view out of this window, but it's really bad for birds. Birds don't understand glass. They hit it, they kill themselves. So this is a product that has been in the works for 25 years at this point. It's out of Germany called Ornolux, and it has an ingrained pattern in it that we don't notice unless you look really, really closely. Cameras focus it out of the picture, but birds see it, and it really helps prevent a ecological travesty, which is glass and birds. Really, really great signage. Again, one of the things we always want to do is minimize the human impact, also the visual impact. We want you to go out there and enjoy nature. We want to interpret it, but we want to do it as minimally as we can so that you get enough education, but you can also imagine that you're in pristine nature. So it's going to talk about the things that people care about: pollinators, the transition from farm back to wildlife habitat, which is a really miraculous story and something we're going to have to do more and more of in the state if we want to get to where we want to get land protection. And there is a look at the trail. Again, it was a pretty cloudy day, but a really beautifully done trail that you can go out and enjoy. So that is kind of a very bird's eye view of our Sustainable Trails program. As I said, please, if you're interested, delve into it even more. It's one of our programs with IWF. I guess, does anyone have any questions for me about the program or anything else? (2024-ish). It's one of those things, because of the topography, because of some of the unknowns in it, weather's going to play a role in it. Alex is down there right now. He may actually be breaking ground as we speak. This is ideal because the ground's frozen. He can get his equipment in and out and do things. If we have a lot of these thaws and freezes and the mud just becomes soup, and that equipment can't do it anymore. So we hope it's going to be about a year worth of construction, but there's some factors that are out of our control. Aaron, anything online? Probably not. Woo-hoo. Okay. So few announcements. We're gonna go into lunch, but something I'll talk about after lunch is IWF generally. One of the programs we do are certified backyard habitats. If you are interested in that program, Aaron was smart. He brought some signs. There's a financial fee, $35 to become a certified wildlife habitat. That is split between National Wildlife Federation and us. So it's good overall, I think, at least. So if you are interested in it, we have, I think, 6 signs out there. Talk to either Aaron or myself, and we can either elaborate on the program or we're happy to sell you a sign. Yes. Is it 12? Do we have some winners now, Ray? Okay. And so this is only a small segment. There's still time to bid on some really cool stuff. Get on your phone and bid. We want your money. Ray, do you want to take over or you want me to do it? I don't really want it, but I can. Ryan Furman, you're the winner of the cheese.
Is Ryan here? Ryan online? Well, Ryan, if you can hear us, you are the winner of the Cheesecake Factory. You get a membership to Eagle Creek.
I think I didn't know this. No. No. Susan Connolly? Conaway? Nope, Susan's not here. She won the Patagonia travel rod cover. Christopher Torp? Also not here. You are the winner of an Eagle Creek annual pass. Yeah, we will get this to you, I promise. Cheryl Swift, are you here? Stacy. Luckily, there's no beer in it, but you win. So this is Gugman House Brewery. Chuck, you won one set of the flies. Amy Silva, are you here? You won the elderberry. Okay, so that is it for round 1 of the silent auction. Again, there's really cool stuff up here. Bid on it, please. And now I think we are an adult enough group that we don't need to dismiss in waves. I think folks can just go up. Lunch is in the back. We have roughly an hour to eat. So enjoy the food, talk amongst yourselves. Feel free to ask any of the speakers questions. I'm sure they would be happy to answer them. Just give them a little bit of time if they're chewing their food, please. So we, again, have about an hour. We'll get back into the program following, and then hopefully people will stick around for the after party as it is. We're going to have speakers and beer and get to talk to them even more following the end of the presentation. So thank you. Enjoy lunch. Okay. I've always dreamt of having Casey Musgraves serenade me up to a microphone, so dreams do come true. We have, Aaron, do we have one or two hats? Sorry, you told me one. Okay, so we have one more hat to kind of help raise awareness about Kopi and also have you wear something really cool. So the last winner of a door prize, and you have to be here for this one. So if you're online, I'm sorry. Matthew Kleinert. You can have it. If you hadn't bought the beer, I wouldn't give this to you. Okay. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed lunch and try not to fall asleep. I'll do my best to keep this brief so we can get on to the interesting speakers. This is just going to be a history and where hopefully we're headed with IWF. And I'm remiss for not already acknowledging everyone who's helped make this organization what it is. I'll bring the board up in a minute. But Emily Wood, who most of you know, did such a great job getting IWF into the position it's in. And I'm lucky to get to stand on her shoulders. Aaron, as you guys know, has held this organization together as the only staff member who knows anything about IWF for a while now. So everyone, please give Aaron a round of applause. He deserves it. Okay, so this is a slide deck, which I stole from Emily. I kind of personalized and updated it a little bit, but if you've been to lots of these conferences, I apologize. You may have seen some of these slides previously. So I hope you guys know what our mission is, but it's pretty straightforward. It is, I think, true to what we do. So I think it is relevant, and it is what we try to live by as employees of IWF. You will hear Drew speak in a bit about NWF, which is our parent umbrella, I suppose, as it is. There are 52 chapters, state affiliates within IWF. So all 50 states, and then the Virgin Islands, US Virgin Islands and Puerto Rico. And I keep asking, how do you get to be the ED of the Virgin Islands? We are broken down into somewhat regionally condensed areas, although I always wonder why Kentucky's in the mid-Atlantic. I grew up in the mid-Atlantic, and Kentucky and Tennessee are about as un-mid-Atlantic as you can be, but for whatever reason, they're there. I think I asked that question about 35 times when we were in Louisiana. Okay, so this is IWF as we stand today. So myself and Aaron, who you met, Jim is our Asian carp expert. He is a federal employee who the grant runs through us, but is great helping us out. He is retiring at the end of this year. So if you guys don't know Jim, hopefully we'll get a chance to introduce him. I've not met him in person. I've talked to him a lot. He's great, wealth of knowledge. So I don't know, maybe he's angling to be the next Asian carp czar. And then Nanette, who works for quite a few nonprofits in the area, does our accountant. She is wonderful. She keeps me in line and explains things over and over and over, because math is as far from my strong suit as anything. Our board of directors. So guys, if you're here and you're on our board, I hate doing this. When I have to stand up in these things, I get really annoyed at the person who made me do it, but I'm going to do it to y'all. So if you guys could please stand up and be acknowledged. Again, we are a small staff. Without this board, we can't do what we do. So very, very appreciative of all of you. So if you could stand up so we can acknowledge you and give you a round of applause, I'd appreciate it. I've worked with and tangential to nonprofits for a long time, and this board is top notch. They care about the mission, they believe in it, and I am very thankful for you guys. So thank you. Okay, so these are our 3 pillars. And again, we try to live by this. We want to educate people. That's Aaron's strong suit. He is wonderful at it. If you've never attended one of Aaron's programs, please do. He is a whiz. He's one of the best naturalists I know, but he has such a great way of kind of speaking to your level. You can be a PhD in the topic and he'll talk with you. You can be a 3-year-old kid that's much more interested in picking dandelions and he'll be able to explain it to you. And it's awesome and it's special to see. Advocacy. So this is where we lean on our board a lot. I am trying to get up to speed with it, but this is not my strong suit. We want to try to drive the discussion in this state. We want to get policies to the table that benefit public lands, wildlife, so on. It's really, really important and it can be challenging. Sometimes it feels like you're pushing a massive boulder up a massive mountain, but it's important and we have to keep doing it. And then actually on the ground doing things, our sustainable trails, our backyard habitats, those are examples of that. But impact days, working with SISMAs to remove invasive plants, to educate people, that's all really, really important too. It's become quite in vogue. 5 years ago, no one really knew who Doug Tallamy was, but this idea of backyard national parks, it's impactful, right? If every one of us were to turn our backyards into good wildlife habitat, we would have something 6 times the size of all the national parks in this country. So think about that. And even though it's small, you're creating really, really, really valuable habitat. So something to consider. Okay, I'm going to breeze through these because I grew up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, and from the day I could read and talk, I've been inundated with history, and I don't like it. It's why I'm in. It's why I'm in what I'm doing now. So history is important, but we want to look to the future. So I'm joking somewhat. Now that I don't live in Gettysburg, I love it. 1938. We are the oldest conservation organization in the state. And that has value, right? It's ebbed and flowed. Sometimes we've been more impactful than others, and hopefully we're going to continue to fight for the causes going forward. The first letter, and we still are doing this, we are now doing it virtually because we believe in conservation of resources. So if you're a member, you get who's your conservation. Again, a lot of this is kind of advocacy highlights of what IWF has done over the years, but supported Muscatatuck to become a national wildlife refuge. Again, that was a kind of novel idea. And again, just like Goose Pond, these places we've talked about, go to Muscatatuck. It is awesome. Again, active in federal policy, trying to make sure that clean water was something that people cared about. And then along that same vein, trying to reduce pesticide usage. So these are things which now no brainer, right? Back then that was kind of groundbreaking. So it's not as easy as it sounds. And of course, a big one, right? DDT being out of the environment. When you walk outside and see a bald eagle today, that's why. It's right. It's that simple. So these things have real world impacts. Again, starting to get involved in environmental education truly. 1970 was a busy year. Hunter safety, right? So we are, of the conservation organizations in the state, we're one of the big, what's referred to hook and bullet organizations. We advocate for hunter and angler rights and access and so on. And as I tried to point out before Callie spoke, sometimes that doesn't seem like natural bedfellows. It should be. And we need to get back to that mentality, because strength in numbers is true. And in this state, guess what? A lot of our elected officials are going to listen to our hunters and anglers a whole lot more readily than they're going to listen to a tree hugging hippie, right? And we all want the same thing in so many ways. So we need to form these groups of kind of different viewpoints that all are after the same end goal. And this is something which you see through the state, but I think there are huge inroads to be made in today's time, utilizing roadways and medians and things like that to create habitats. So in 81, I was I was 1 year, 362 days old then. We became IWF as we know it today. Again, this is a lot of this stuff seems like a no-brainer now, but when it was happening, it was progressive. It was something that you kind of went out on a limb to do. Wetlands, we'll hear Will's talk in just a moment. Sometimes you make a few steps forward, take a few steps back, and then you have to step forward again. So we're kind of going back and forth all the time. Get environmental education. This is something I can talk about forever. It's something I'm so passionate about. Is most of us in this room, the world's not going to fall apart completely in the next, whatever, our lifetimes. The young kids today, that's not the case. Like this really, really, really matters. And I think having them as part of our coalition is increasingly important. Great Lakes, right? Starting to think, obviously we border a Great Lake, but we are a Great Lake state. Until I moved here, I never would have said Indiana is a Great Lake state. It is. And actually focusing on that because the Great Lakes and the watershed impacts all of us. So having these outside of your state entities that work together is the only way we're going to get these things done. If only Indiana cared about Kopi, we'd be out of luck, right? So you need these coalitions, regional coalitions to make things work. Again, fought for a permanent ban on canned hunting. So we are an advocate for hunters' rights and hunter access, but occasionally we'll take stands that aren't popular with a large portion of the community. So that is a role that I think is really, really important. And IWF does historically a great job of taking stances that may not be the most popular, but try to ground them in science, try to do things that make sense, even if they aren't the easiest and most popular path forward. This is coming up again, and IWF will serve a role in helping DNR formulate their next wildlife implementation plan. Action plan, sorry. Monarchs, everyone knows they're federally endangered now, right? So we have been beating this drum for a while. We'll continue to beat it. It's really important, right? It's just a monarch, but it's a sign of what's happening. So it's kind of the canary in the coal mine as it would be. And then again, another hunting rights issue. DNR had proposed a season on bobcats. IWF asked for the science, deemed it wasn't there, and opposed it. You know, there were a lot of people who are probably still angry about this, but it's where the science led. And I think that's where we need to keep going, is let science lead you, make educated decisions. We all know policymakers can't know everything. That's our role, is to educate them and tell them why these things make sense. 2022, we have about 4,500 members, including affiliate organizations. That's lower than it has been historically. And I'll touch on why I think that is now. People are disconnected with nature. Look at Indiana, right? You always hear about the rural urban divide. That's nature access. Kids who grow up in urban centers don't always have access to this. So if you don't experience nature, you don't understand nature, you don't particularly care about nature. We need to get past that. We need to expose people to this. This is something, I've got a 12-year-old and a 9-year-old, and my kids are really, really good at going outside and doing stuff, but they're also really good at sitting on their butts with an iPad and watching a video about nature, which makes no sense to me, but this stuff is accessible at literally the press of a finger, right? And we have to A, accept that, but B, deal with it, right? That's easy, but we have to use that as a gateway. So when I worked at Holiday Park in environmental education, one thing we would always do is use that as a gateway, draw on those parallels that they're familiar with to expose them to things they aren't familiar with. And I guarantee you, any kid who's watching a video about, I don't know how many kids do this, but let's say they're watching a video about snow geese. It's pretty cool on a screen, right? You take them down to Goose Pond, it's a different world. The real thing is better. And that's what we need to get through to these kids. This is really, really important. Access to natural spaces is limited. Sometimes there's costs associated. Sometimes it's just proximity. Whatever it is, we need to get around that and get people into these places, because the more people who love them, the better chance we have of preserving them. Indiana does not have nearly as much public land as we want it to. There is a concept being pushed around right now that wants 30% of all land to be protected. Break it down by whatever municipality you are. Guess who falls really, really, really short of that goal? Indiana. Some of our Western states are approaching it. We're nowhere near it. And if we really believe in that, and something I think is really important, we need to act and we need to keep working to acquire land, make this stuff accessible to people. Accessibility is something I will beat a drum on all day long, because just because it's there doesn't mean people use it. We need to get people into it. And a really big one, and everyone who hunts or fish knows this, those numbers are just down. Fishing licenses, hunting licenses, they aren't selling. That's how we fund so much conservation. So even if you don't like hunting, you don't have to do it. Go buy yourself a duck stamp, because that money comes right back and does good. Okay, conservation priorities. Again, these don't change. Sometimes it's a little bit discouraging. It has been a priority for 30 years and it's still a priority because it's still a problem. Invasive species, habitat, native plants, water quality. I'm not going to read it. You guys are all literate. So some of these are big, big, big. Some of these are small, small, small. And it takes all of them together to get to where we need to get to. Right? So why does climate change matter here? We're not going to have sea level encroachment in Indiana, but guys, we had a burn ban in central Indiana last summer. That's not great, right? So we have lots and lots of water here, but water's going to be an issue. It's a real issue in some places. It's going to be an issue here. So all these things, they may be a little bit less acute in Indiana, but they matter. Oh, sorry. This is crazy, but right? Invasive species are so problematic. They outcompete our natives. Oftentimes the ones that are successful at invading an area are really, really hardy and really fast producing. So some of these species that are a little more long-lived, maybe are slower reproductive, right? Or just need really, really unique habitat requirements, a generalist is going to outcompete them. And I had, he's deceased now, but one of my mentors in DC had this quote, which has stuck with me forever. The time to conserve things is when they're plentiful, not when they're rare. Anne can talk about that. When you've got a handful of whooping cranes, God, I bet they wish they did it when there were 1,000, right? It's just, now is the time to do these things. We know what's coming, right? We've seen it for our entire existence. Act now. It makes it a whole lot easier. So here you go. This is why Asian carp are a problem. They're everywhere. Emerald ash borer. As I was driving in here today, I don't know if you guys saw it, there was a huge ash tree that just fell over and it had no roots left. It was killed by the emerald ash borer. Plants. Callie talked about Callery Paris, her old friend. Who knows what that is? When I worked at Holiday Park, that was my favorite. Buckthorns, right? Really, really, really nasty. Garlic mustard. It tastes really good, so pick it and cook it. And this is just something I thought was fun. I like the name Burning Bush. This is what I wish burning bushes were. Okay, native plants, right? It's not enough just to eradicate invasives, because if you eradicate invasives, well, they came in there, they're going to come back. You need to get in resilient, properly placed species that can get a good foothold, and they will help keep out invasives. But you have to keep managing. This is not like a do it and forget it, right? You know, right? Management is important. And one thing, and I'm relatively new to this, one thing that I used to be pretty squirrely about using pesticides. I didn't like them. I was like, oh, Roundup's gross, whatnot. It is a tool in your tool bag, and without it, we're out of luck. So you don't have to use it, but I implore each of you to accept the use of herbicides as necessary, because it is a really, really, really valuable tool. Water quality. We all know this. Water is an issue, both for animals and also for us, right? There's a lot of people in the state that don't have good water, and we're starting to hear things right now about water being diverted for projects and whatnot. This is going to continue to be a big issue, an increasing issue. Industry, which we really like in the state, and we continue to try to recruit requires a lot of water. So water usage is going to become increasingly important, I believe. And again, this is much more, this hits much closer to home now that I've got 2 kids that I kind of look through their eyes. We need to get them in a position where they can enjoy what we do. All of you are here, I imagine, because you love nature, you love the outdoors, you love wildlife. You want that for the next generation, right? And if we don't do the right things now, they're out of luck. Okay, so I talked about sustainable trails earlier. This is just an IWF program. Here's my QR code again. So you saw this slide before, but those are the trails. We're going to continue to expand on that, hopefully bring more and more trails in. And you can see there's some big open areas in the state. If any of you know of a property that wants to partner on this, let us know. Certified wildlife habitat, go buy those signs. Aaron wants to sell them. He doesn't want to have to put them back in his car. Really, really important. This is just, it's common sense what you need, but you need food, you need water, you need cover, places to raise young. That is what animals need to thrive. And right, your backyard is probably not big enough to support a bison herd, but it's big enough to support insects, birds, amphibians, reptiles, right? So maybe those charismatic megafauna aren't going to benefit from this, but everything else will. And then again, sustainable practices. This is something which I'm still learning about. I'm sure everyone here can learn more about, but not all plants are going to do great in all places. So talk to someone who knows about it. There's a lot of resources. There's a lot of resources in this room that can help you guys with that. So if that's something you're interested in, let's figure it out, because the more people who are part of this movement, the better we're going to be. There's that beautiful sign you can get. So future priorities, right? This is not what we want, but this is what's happening in a lot of places. So, and these are kind of my personal ambitions, but also things I've talked about with the board and where I think a lot of them are. I want to really engage with the hook and bullet community. They are influential in this state, and I think a lot of our aspirations align. So we are going to be at the State House in February at Sportsman Day, right? Ducks Unlimited is organizing it. We are going to be one of the co-sponsors of it because we want to be at the table when those discussions happen, either in favor of what they're proposing or against it, as we've been in the past. But we need to have a seat at that table if we're going to be effective. Siting of renewable energy. This is really, really important. Everyone has talked about in various ways. Renewable energy is important. It has a lot of really beneficial aspects, but it has some big downsides. Transmission through power lines, right? That creates problems, as Anne was pointing out. Loss of habitat due to this, that's important. But then even if you get outside of the conservation element, the human element is really, really important. Do we want these farms completely turning into solar fields? I don't know what the answer is to that, but it's a discussion that needs to be had and needs to be figured out. So that is going to become increasingly important. We are the Indiana Wildlife Federation. We're not the Indianapolis Wildlife Federation. A lot of the board and staff are in the central Indiana area for obvious reasons, right? The State House is here, makes sense, things like that. But I really, really want to expand IWF's reach into outside of central Indiana. So we'll be up at the dunes for their Big Birding Festival in March. If you guys know of opportunities throughout the state, let us know. We want to be there. We want to be at the table. This is a farm bill year, right? Most people don't think of the farm bill and conservation hand in hand. Who here has heard of RAWA? Recovering America's Wildlife Act? Okay, well, if you haven't, you should. It's really, really important. It did not get passed into law in the last legislature, so this is a federal law. It was close. I think a lot of us mourned its lack of passage and thought it was dead. It's not. So NWF, this is one of their big issues, and we're on board with it. Recovering America's Wildlife Act would be transformational for the way we manage wildlife throughout the country and this state in particular. Guess what? The Farm Bill has more money for conservation in it than RAWA will ever have. So much can be done through this. And Indiana has a senator and a rep who both sit on those committees. So we are an important state in this. And then environmental education in schools. You know, I think IWF brought this up years and years ago. It's not in the curriculum in the state of Indiana. It should be. Every kid should learn about environmental education because it is important for them, and they're going to have to deal with the consequences of what we do for an awful long time. So reaching out, getting kids exposed to this is so important. And then figure out how to influence land developers. The Indiana legislature, if you were to guess what profession is the predominant profession throughout the legislature, historically you'd say lawyer, right? That's probably true. Maybe you'd say doctor. It'd make a lot of sense. Guess what? It's land developer, and explains a lot, right? So if you can't influence that, then you're not at the table. And that's what this is about. We need to have our voice and our constituents' voices heard if we're going to have an impact. So figuring out how to ingrain yourself with that community. And it doesn't have to be beating somebody over the head with a steel pole. It could be holding a carrot in front of them. There are small things at the margins which can make big differences. And then maybe we'll get to some, I don't know if I want to get to this, but I thought that was a cool picture. So questions for me, or we can move on to our next speaker. Nothing online? I'm getting off easy. I love it. Okay. How far ahead of schedule are we? Will, are you ready? Okay. So I'll get your slide up. So we're really, really lucky to have Will Ditzler here talking to us about the state of water and wetlands in our state. That I don't know how else to say other than the state of water in our state. You guys have probably followed this in the news, right? So Will chaired the commission that looked into what we should be doing and how we should be doing it with wetlands, water, and such throughout Indiana. And I think if there's a time for questions and answers, this is it, because he knows so much on the topic. And it's rare to have an opportunity to have a content expert who is talking about something that impacts and affects each and every one of us. So you'll be in a treat. You're in for a treat with his presentation. But sorry to put you on the spot. Take advantage of picking his brain while he's here.
So I don't have a real fancy slide deck or anything. There's not a lot, pictures and things to show about the wetland task force, but I do have a few slides just as an outline to kind of guide me on what to share with you guys. But, I did want to say I'm a Indiana Wildlife Federation life member. I've been a member for years. So thank you for what you guys are doing. And I appreciate learning more about what you're working on, Dan. I went to school in Bloomington, and I took a class. I was majoring in business, and I took a class from a professor named Dr. Whitehead. And that class really changed the trajectory of my life. And I wrote him a letter about that because I ended up saying, this is what I love. It was a class in environmental biology. So that would have been 1987 or something like that. And I made every class, even after they won the national championship, I was there the next morning because I loved that class. And I've just, that's where I discovered my love for the outdoors. And I started joining all these organizations like the Nature Conservancy and Wildlife Federation. So I do understand, I'm a fisherman and a hunter and an outdoor enthusiast. I've planted 80,000 trees in my life, and I'm still going at it. I'd order them every year. Restored wetlands on pretty much every property I've ever had my hands on. I think I've restored 5 different wetlands. One of them is really probably maybe the greatest thing that ever happened to me in conservation. I've restored a wetland using the farm program monies with a conservationist named Rick Duff. Some of you probably know Rick. We built this wetland. Tom Hewitt was the local DNR biologist. And I pull up with my 2 young boys and I look out onto this 1.5 acre wetland, and there's these huge white birds out there. You can guess what they were. And they were coming back they had been flown down with ultralight, and they were returning. There was like 13 or 14 juveniles returning from Florida back to Wisconsin, and they landed on my wetland for 3 days. There was a north wind. Yeah, I'm telling, it was incredible. I still can't believe it happened to me. I called Tommy, says, yeah, we know about them. They were already on them. They didn't want to make a big deal out of it, but because everybody would have been on my property, right? So anyway, I've got a heart for the same things you do. And I was chosen to run this task force. And I think a few of the reasons why I was chosen, and I questioned whether it was going to be worth it, right? Because it's like, there was a lot of time. Do they really care about this? But I couldn't turn it down, right? And but I worked at a company called JF New, and we did wetland mitigation permitting. So I knew the developers, I knew the Home Builders Association. I know they were our clients, much like you can relate. I worked for them, but then I also worked with biologists, and we were all conservationists. And so I understand, both sides of that. And there are both sides of that. I mean, sometimes the regulatory processes can be really frustrating, and sometimes improvements are needed. But I am a believer in wetlands and conservation at heart. And so, hopefully I brought a good balance to it. We met in this room right here. We had a series of 5 meetings. And if you want to throw up the first slide, if you have that. Do I run them? Okay, cool. So we met in this room. There were 13 of us. Let's talk about what the bill is, or what it was in the first place. It was Senate Bill 389. Basically, it lessened protections for state isolated wetlands. So you probably understand this, but there's federally protected wetlands by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, which are basically connected to navigable waters of the U.S. And that's a broad term, right? Anything that's adjacent to stream, ditch, lake, and has any kind of hydrological connection is considered a federally jurisdictional wetland. Anything that's isolated or cut off from that is a state jurisdictional wetland, and we have a lot of those. In fact, the majority of the wetlands left in the state are isolated. And as you mentioned with your habitat program in the backyard, small little systems are important. They're spread throughout the landscape. It's important that we have them. But there are some people who think the state shouldn't regulate wetlands. They basically take the position. You can imagine a lot of our state legislator feels this way, that, well, if the feds aren't regulating it, why should we? Less regulation better. Let's just go with theirs. Well, I think that's a very short-sighted view when you look at the importance of wetlands. So like you said, trying to educate and make the point as to why do we even care about these things? So it lessened protection, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. It reclassified wetland categories, and it broadened exemptions. So this bill was really driven by the development and home building community wanting less, regulation. And so they wanted to broaden the exemptions, particularly around the conversion of farmland to development land. And they did accomplish some of that. It exempts lower quality, smaller farmed wetlands from regulation. And there is some point to this. I mean, I do get the fact that you look out in the farm field and maybe there's this wet spot, and then they have to spend literally hundreds of thousands of dollars to mitigate that. There is, I can see that, right? There's a cost benefit there. And those wetlands usually are lesser quality, particularly from a wildlife or a habitat standpoint, but they still hold water in rain events, and they still have some, habitat. And we've lost so many of our wetlands, approximately 90% have already been lost in the state of Indiana, that everything we have left matters at this point. So, there's got, I can see the issue, but, you'll see as I go on here, where kind of what the big picture of this is. The federal rules lessen the impact of the bill. So they really, they passed this bill And then, you know, the administration changed, and every time the administration changes at the federal level, it goes right one way or the other. Like you get a Republican president and they basically pull everything back. You get, and so every 4 or 8 years or whatever, it's this swinging thing. And the state would like to be aligned with the federal, but there's really no way to do it. And the federal government is very slow on the permitting. I mean, it's not good. It takes as much as 6 months just to get them to answer whether your wetland is jurisdictional or not. And it's always been a challenge, but it's particularly bad right now. It's like you've probably seen with the IRS, if any of you guys know, or accountants or that do taxes, you know, they can't get things from it. So it's a legitimate issue, but it's not really something that the state can control. And then the other thing this bill did is it established this task force. It specified who was to be on it, you know, one person from the farm community, one person from the drainage community, several environmental positions were designated, academic. It didn't state who the chairperson would be, but you know, obviously that ended up being me through being suggested to the governor's office. So that's really an overview. So we had 13 members. Really, the participation was really, really good. I got to give the task force a lot of credit for showing up, because, you know, they had to drive, some of them 2 and 3 hours to get to these meetings. And, you know, my job, I tried to do was make those meetings worth their time. You know, we start and finished on time. We had an agenda. Everybody had a voice, and we made them productive. And so I think that was good. Right. And that's it's not, as a chairperson, it wasn't my job to drive the results per se, but to create space for the conversations to happen. And, you know, I wasn't really sure what to expect, but it wasn't really that contentious. I mean, there was a few things where obviously people disagreed on things, but the farmer that was on our board, he was reasonable, right? I mean, he was a traditional, you know, mentality of a farmer, wasn't wasn't big in cover crops and conservation practices, unfortunately, but he was really, you know, a reasonable person. The one participation we lacked which was ironic, was the home builder developer never showed up for any of the meetings. And so, you know, they drove the legislation. They had a spot on the board, but he never came. He never emailed me or anything. And I didn't want to, you know, call it out in a big way or whatever. I had to note that voice was missing. The Builders Association did come to a couple meetings for public comments. So that was helpful because we could get their perspective. A lot of you probably know Ray McCormick. He came to the meetings. He's a great conservation farmer. If everybody in the state farmed like him, we'd have a lot different quality of water and habitat in this state. So really appreciated Ray showing up. And Ray's a farmer, but he basically said, hey, you know what? You guys are building all this stuff up here and you're flooding me out down in the southern half of the state. So he was kind of the opposite voice of the Farm Bureau. He was basically saying not all farmers want to drain wetlands, you know, so that was nice. We had, you know, the Hoosier Environmental Council. I don't know if anybody's here from there, but they were great at attending. The Nature Conservancy was good. Farm Bureau and builders attended a few meetings. So we had good public participation. So our priorities, there were like 10 things that they asked us to do. We looked at them all, we ranked them, and we basically said there's 4 that we want to focus on. And that was reviewing the isolated permitting processes, the classifications, and see how if we could get better alignment with the Corps. How to create incentivize to avoid impacts to isolated wetlands. You know, if we have a wetland, let's leave it and work around it. And even if we have to create financial or tax incentives to do that, let's do that, you know. And then strategies to incentivize preservation of existing wetlands outside of development processes and voluntary restoration and creation. So we had like Scott Fetters come in from the National Wildlife, from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife, and talk about, you know, that they've built over 10,000 acres in the last 10 years of wetlands without any regulations, right? With voluntary people. We need more of that. We had a lot of people come testify or present. We probably had 15 different presenters. Scott was one of them. but we had, you know, people from academic, Bob Barr was there. We had people from, you know, we had people from the energy sector, from the utilities. So I wanted to mention that as well. And then also review the current Indiana Stream and Wetland Mitigation Program. So is anybody here from the DNR? Okay, so we'd have one or two DNR people. The DNR currently runs the way most mitigation is done in the state. So when I was first in this business in the early 90s, most of the mitigation was done on site. They'd tuck it in, you know, most of it was really like stormwater ponds that they'd planted stuff on the edge and try to call it, you know, wetland mitigation. But that was the early days. And we, you know, we got more native plant supply and more understanding of how to do the science of mitigation, and it progressed. And then there was a lot of what's called wetland mitigation banking, where we do big pooled sites with private sector, and actually took some steps forward. There's pros and cons to that, but overall it created a higher level of accountability, better success, and some larger scale projects. I don't know how many years ago it was, maybe, I don't know, 5 or 6 years ago, the DNR took the authority to create this bank, if you want to call it, or it's in lieu program. In lieu of doing my own mitigation, I'm going to write a check and you do it for me. So the DNR is in charge of that right now. We chose that as one of the important things because it's where most mitigation is getting done right now, and it's behind, and it's really important that the program succeeds. And so it was like wanting to, you know, have a level of accountability and transparency to the DNR, but also, you know, mostly just help them get the resources they need for this program to succeed. Because from an environmental community standpoint, there's millions, $50–60 million of checks being written in, and that money is supposed to go build wetlands and streams. And every time it's, you know, every year that those functions and values aren't being replaced on the landscape, we're losing what the mitigation was intended for. So that's something I think is important for your group to know, to support. How can we help the DNR successfully run this program? It's not an easy thing to run because they're trying to find places to build these mitigations. And a lot of them are stream mitigation. And we have so much of our streams in Indiana are regulated drainage ditches and drainage systems that the goals of the drainage laws and the mitigation are not, they're not coherent. They compete with each other. So what were the major findings? And then I'd like to open it up for any questions. Flooding frequency and costs are increasing and are partially caused by cumulative loss of wetlands in our watersheds. This was probably the biggest takeaway for our task force, is that we have a flooding problem in the state of Indiana. And it's getting worse, and it's just going to continue to get worse. Bob Bard basically said every 10 years, it's going to get 10% worse at the current rate of changing climate, rainfall patterns, and the continued loss of storage in the landscape. So it's, you know, just like out west, it's getting worse with the drought stuff and they're losing water. In our case, it's getting worse the other way. We are going to get more rain, big events in different parts of the year, and we have less storage in the landscape. We still have the mentality of getting it off as fast as we can. You know, there's a getting it off the land as fast as we can and push it downstream. There's a task force right now on drainage, and I went and presented this to them, and, you know, they just stared at me like they didn't want to hear what I had to say, and I was trying to be balanced, but we have a flooding problem. So you guys are talking about how fast can we get this water off these farmers' lands? And well, every time you take it faster off of your land, you're putting it faster on me downstream. It's just that you know, the water has to go somewhere, right? So the more storage we have up in the landscape, the less of problems for farmers, for developers, for people, you know, all of us, right? Every citizen of the state should care about water quantity and quality. And you know, we're not headed in a good direction that way. And this bill is an example of really the thinking of going the other direction rather than forward. It's appropriate and necessary for the state to regulate wetlands. I mean, even the farmer and those folks on board supported that. It's reasonable. It's appropriate, right? So we wanted the legislature to know, because they thought about just getting rid of the program completely, which would have been a lot worse, in my perspective. Cumulative loss. This was a huge takeaway that I want you guys to understand. cumulative loss requires more than just a regulatory approach. We can argue about 2-to-1 ratio or this and that in the regulatory program. But at the end of the day, we've lost so many wetlands that whether we mitigate this better, this ratio or that ratio is not going to solve the problem. We need to build significant amount of wetlands back in our landscape, thousands and thousands of acres, really, if we're going to do what we need to do. And that's not going to come just through regulation. It's going to come through at some point, hopefully, maybe it's your kids that'll, put the people in office that'll do that kind of thing. But we should be spending tens of millions of dollars every year putting storage on the landscape. You look at our state, and I'm not a political person at all, but you look at our state budget surplus and the billions of dollars we have, and what do we put towards conservation? Thankfully, we've got potentially 25 million this year with conservation organizations like you guys working with the governor to get that in there. Now, hopefully the rest of the folks will leave it in there. And that's good. 25 million that's a good number. And we had that from the federal government a few years ago, and we made a big difference. But it really, John, it should be 5 times that every year. That's what, if we really care about conservation in the state of Indiana, at some point we need to act like it, right? Like Michigan or Wisconsin, some of these other states do. Even the state of Ohio, and we're very similar to Ohio, I think, if you would think of culturally, politically, demographically, they're spending 150 to 200 million on water. What it took to get there is Lake Erie basically dying, and they lost their water. So how do humans deal with things? We wait till it's the worst crisis, right? That we don't have any water left in Lake Mead. So, oh my God, we got to do something about watering alfalfa in the desert, right? So, yeah, I mean, it's just, we need to get there. So we got to push for that. Public support for wetlands is strong. The Audubon Society did a study, and we had it come out in time for our report. And it basically says like 80% of Hoosiers think that wetlands are important and that the state should, protect them and build them. The in lieu of fees popular, it's behind and it's important. So this program is a priority. That's a conclusion we made, and the success is a priority. Alignment with the Corps is not in the state's control. So we basically said, you asked us to figure out how to align it. You can't, because the federal government is going to do what they're going to do. And we've got to have our own state program and just do what we can control. And then, the state agencies are understaffed and they have a turnover and a competitive problem. Brian Ruckenhauser, I believe his name was on our board. He's the IDEM commissioner. He was a great participant. He showed up for every meeting. He wasn't pushing for this. In fact, he said, hey, I don't want it to be perceived like I'm lobbying for this. But it was a conclusion that we came to. I mean, this is something that, let's say you are a home builder or developer, and wouldn't you want the agencies to be well staffed so that your permits can be done faster? I don't get how that one should be a conflict. I mean, once again, we go back, we've got a healthy state budget, and I'm proud that we have a healthy state budget. I mean, good for us for being a good fiscally managed state. Like, that's good. What are we going to do with the fact that we've done that? Let's pay our state employees well. Let's invest in conservation. People care about it, So that's what I had to offer up. I'd be glad to answer anything. I'm a very transparent person, and tell you whatever I know if you have any questions about wetlands in general or about the bill or the process. Thank you.
Got a couple from our virtual audience. Deborah wants to know, what's the story behind the tree that you're standing in front of in the first image?
Oh, that's a great story. Thanks for asking. So Jim New founded JF New where I worked, and ended up running that company. And it was a dream job for me. I worked with a lot of wildlife biologists and botanists. Scott Namesnick, who's now the DNR state botanist, he and I worked together. Anyway, Jim lives in Costa Rica now. And he lives in a little piece of the jungle with the coolest stuff in his yard you could ever see. You talk about wildlife habitat in his backyard. It's at a whole nother level. Pumas, jaguarundes, toucans. It's amazing. Monkeys, three different species of monkeys. So that's on the Osa Peninsula in Costa Rica. And Jim and Judy New and my wife and I were there. And that's the largest tree I'd ever seen in my life. And I love trees, man. I love trees. And like I said, I've planted a lot of trees. And so that's I don't know what the species is, but it was an incredible tree and I had to get a picture with it. So.
Adrian would like to know if there are any links made with public health entities to encourage additional financial and policy support.
I don't know. There weren't public health agencies involved with the process other than IDEM. I guess I would consider them a public health agency. But it's a good point because, this gets back to, I think about what you said about your kids, Dan. You should be able to eat fish out of the water, right? You should, and you should be able to swim in the water. And so wetlands and flooding, they are a public health issue as well. So I'm glad they asked that, but I don't know of any other links.
And then last question I have is, what percentage of the mitigation fees that are collected are currently being utilized?
Well, they've spent, by the way, you can access the report. In fact, if anybody doesn't know how to access and they want it, I'm sure the Wildlife Federation could get it for you, or you could just reach out to me and I can send it to you. But I think they've collected at the time, it seems like it was north of $50 million, and no wetlands or streams had been built at that point, which is the challenge, right? So there's $50 million sitting in there. It's probably more now, maybe 60 or 80 million. And to date, it hasn't been put to work on the ground. Now they have spent, I think they had spent, and it's in the report, 8 million maybe on, different parts that are going to end up being mitigation. But there is a part that comes off top for administration. I forget the fee. And then the rest of it is used to build wetlands. So if the program gets going successfully, it should be a good thing, right? It's just that, we're concerned that they're behind, and you're supposed to build the wetlands within 3 years of the permit. And at the end of the day, the Corps of Engineers is the boss on this thing. And if we don't, as a state, follow through and build the wetlands, eventually the Corps will, come in and hold us accountable for not building the wetlands that we're paid for. So. No, I think they would just pull the program from the DNRs. What they would do, I would think they would say, they've given the DNR permission to own this program. I would think they would pull it, and then that money would probably get used somehow. Maybe it would go into private mitigation banking systems to put it to work, or the DNR would be required to do it and just be granted more time. But then in the future, the program would be pulled. Those are the things that I think would happen.
Do you have any idea of what the results of this are going to be?
This task force?
Yes.
That's the
reception
question. Right? I mean, trust me, man. I questioned whether I even wanted to do this because it was a huge job. It was a lot more time than I thought, because not just the meetings, I running the meetings, that's fun. It's good. It's all the work going into the meetings and the follow up and writing the report and everything. And I don't know, from when right before Christmas, they asked me to come in and share and there was a bunch of senators in the room. It was at the State House. And I presented kind of this, and they just kind of looked at me. There wasn't one question. And I was just like, geez. I don't think they wanted to hear what I said, which is we have a flooding problem, and we need to spend more money on this issue. So I don't know.
So the results are mixed. There's a doubt about how they'll use this.
I think so. I think if nothing else, it's an educational piece, right? Like it was in the Indy Star, it was on NPR, it's out there. I believe it is making a difference. I just don't believe you're going to see in the next few years our state legislature do anything with it from their standpoint. But is it making a difference outside of that? I hope so. Maybe in the governor's office is open. Well, I think it's you guys. It's John Ketzenberger with TNC, right? It's that's what we got to do. We just got to keep hammering the message. And honestly, I think it's just going to have to get bad enough that the constituents are hammering them. Right now, who's hammering them is the farmer whose drainage ditch he couldn't get a permit for, and he's mad about it, and he wants to hog out the stream that runs through his land and burn all the trees. That's who they're hearing from, right? We need to get to a point where we're hearing from citizens that we're tired of the flooding. I can't do, this sucks. And so then they'll hopefully at that point, they'll start caring, because right now they're not hearing enough from environmental people or citizens about these issues. Mhm. Yeah, no, I totally get it. And there are landowners like you out there who want that stream to be a stream, not a ditch, right? And yeah, I get it. Yeah. Yes, sir. Yeah.
Here's, let's. Yeah, question about each county in the state has a ditch board basically.
Right.
And each one regulates their own county. So how, with your program, are you gonna reach out to that level? Because you were saying you're not getting a lot of response or pressure on the candidates or legislative people that are in power now. So do you have a plan in place to get down to those grassroots levels? And her issue per se, as she stated, is right there in the county. So, I mean,
Yeah,
there's a big jump there between the county and where you're at right now.
Yeah.
And that's a gap that I'm seeing that needs to be filled somehow.
Yeah.
And I just wonder.
There's no plan out of here on that. But you're right as to what needs to happen. We did have 2 drainage people on the task force, and they were great to work with. I mean, they get it. They weren't like anti environment. I think the drainage laws are what they are, and there's a lot of authority there. Like you can see that basically it's just so ironic, right? Because it's like all about the private property rights until it's your property that they want to drain out. And most of our streams are regulated. A lot of them are. So you could have something that it doesn't even look like a ditch. It could be a nice stream. And if it's a regulated drain, they have the ability, to do that kind of thing. So yeah, I don't know what the answer is, but you bring up a good point.
I was going to ask, on a positive note, are we hitting some singles? I mean, are we restoring some lands, and where?
I think a positive note is U.S. Fish and Wildlife's Partners for Wildlife program. I said they've built over 10,000 acres of wetlands. There's a question in the back here, in the last decade. And I think that's what we got to do more of. And, in terms of a positive note, what I do this stuff is everything I have control or influence on, I build a wetland, right? I think I've built 5 wetlands, and I've one time it was on a 5 acres where our house was, and I built a wetland on it because there's a lot of hydric soils in the state of Indiana. So if any of you own land, look at, see if there's a place you can build a wetland. We've all got to just go build wetlands ourselves to the degree we have the ability, or help fund that if you don't own property. And then, there's some good voluntary restoration going on. And that stuff makes a big difference. Like I said, that's where the cranes landed. How many people have ever been involved with personally restoring a wetland? Has anybody done that? Handful of people. I mean, it's incredible when you put the water back on the ground, what happens. I mean, a lot of times it involves tearing out drainage tiles or even a small, maybe an acre area. The amount of amphibians and reptiles that are in there instantly, it's incredible. Like deafening in the spring with frogs, the amount of frogs that come into something, and it's just putting the water back on the hydric soil that's been there forever, you know. It's really rewarding. So I think the positive thing is, what can we do as individuals? What can the Indiana Wildlife Federation do? What can the Nature Conservancy do? What can we do to go build wetlands and fund building wetlands while we're waiting on the tide to change? And I think there will be a day when the younger people will vote people that care about conservation. Right now, conservation is just right. It's not, it's never there. It's like taxes, gas prices, economy, blah, 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 blah. And the environment, until the environment gets in the top 3 consistently, we're going to have to do through the private sector, through nonprofits and as individuals, what we can do. Question in the back?
Speaking of Indiana Drainage Code, and maybe this has to do with wetlands too, you know, there could be some legislative solutions. I think if every county surveyor and or head of the local drainage board was required to go to the Indiana Watershed Leadership Academy, like I did, which is primarily funded by the state, and some of them do. There were some in my class. That would, you know, making that requirement would help. Making legislating that the local soil and water conservation district should be part of the drainage board, you know, or connected somehow, that could help. And the question I had is, and I don't know if this has to do anything we're talking about. Do you know anything about the legislation about DNR floodplain maps that's come up from Senator Lysing?
Yeah, I don't, but that they were talking about that when I went in there in December, and it was not pretty for the DNR. They were really, yeah, they were just ripping them. And you know, I guess I'll say that, I mean, I get to vent a little bit with you guys, and you know, I go into that meeting and it's a task force like we ran, and it was very combative. I mean, they were just mean spirited to the people that were presenting that. That wasn't a case in our wetlands task force. And I think it's because I was running it, and the person running that task force is a senator, and it's just something about, right, the way they work is that they just want to, you know, it was just interesting, the demeanor, because there was none of that in ours. I mean, there were some things that we might have had some, you know, but it was very cordial. And so, and to your other points, you know, I agree. And those are some good ideas. One thing I did want to mention along those lines too, we had a couple a River Basin Commission person on there, the St. Joe River Basin Commission. And there also is I believe a Kankakee River Basin Commission. And I think they're making some if you can get these river basin commissions and start looking at things as a watershed, because really we got these counties, right? 90 whatever counties with drainage boards. It should be a watershed issue, not a county issue. And so anything we can do to move our regulations and our approaches to a watershed based, I think is going to be a better approach. And I think the conservation organizations can push that message: watersheds, watersheds, watersheds versus county and state lines.
We have one more question from a virtual member. Adrian wants to know if insurance companies have weighed in on all this work.
Yeah, they weren't involved with the task force, but I think ultimately that is part of what's going to be involved, right? I mean, think about what's going on in Florida, and you know, eventually that's business, right? That's big business, big dollars. I think it's real issues about the insurance companies. I think that's a part of where the economics will begin to work in the favor of what we're talking about here.
Familiar with the other commissions, but one you might want to look at, the Blue River Commission down in Harrison County, has actually been very successful. They've planted tons of trees and have addressed sewage issues and septic tank issues, and
that's good.
It's been a successful.
That's a great watershed. That's where they're doing the Hellbender reintroduction, which is really cool. If you haven't checked that out, check that out.
So I think we can mostly all agree that it's very discouraging that our leaders in our state legislature are made up of developers, right? That feels like an uphill battle. In some nursing organizations that I'm in, we employ part-time lobbyists. And I wonder if there are any lobbyists that TNC and this organization and others share or invest in to get the word across with a different approach maybe than we've used in the past.
Yeah, I mean, I believe Hoosier Environmental Council has a very active lobbying presence, and the Nature Conservancy has a full-time government affairs person, John Ketzenberger. And, you know, the Nature Conservancy is big and they've got resources to work with. And so I think, you know, like Indiana Wildlife Federation, I would imagine that you communicate with them and
Right.
are working together.
Yeah,
Right.
just, there's a conservation group that's a coalition that we're part of. And it includes Ducks Unlimited, it includes Hoosier Environmental Council, Nature Conservancy. Dan and John Goss is not here now, participate in those. So we're very active in those groups, trying the approach that numbers matter and collectively we can make a difference, but it's an uphill fight.
Well, he just walked back in the room, but I will say you're very fortunate to have John on your board. I saw DNR directors over a 30-year period of my business, and I would say John was the best DNR director in my lifetime. He was pragmatic, he got things done, and I'm serious. And so
He'll make sure to pay you. in a
Yeah,
few
no,
minutes.
you guys are lucky to have him on your board, and he understands this stuff at a level, you know, that I don't, in terms of how the legislative process works and the DNR and all that. So yeah, glad I didn't know you were on the board. I'm glad you are. Yeah. Yeah.
Last question.
Did you guys do a study of how much the flooding costs so that you can present to legislators, look, you'll save money if you prevent all this flooding?
We didn't do a study, but there were people that came in from the academic community that have that information. I'd say if you're interested in that kind of thing, Bob Barr with the Center for Earth Studies, I believe it is, at IUPUI in Indianapolis, is really big on this issue. And his presentation was pretty, you know, humbling in terms of like the data. It's not good, right? And he said, like, you know, you keep filling in these wetlands, it's just going to contribute to a problem. So I'm sure there are economic numbers. We didn't specifically cite those in our report, but I think you're right? That's what it's going to take. Most people, what do they care about? Economics, et cetera. And, you know, I think that will help with what we want to do here in terms of with wildlife and the things we care about. That argument will be a part of how we get there. Well, it's nice to present to an audience that actually was interested in the topic. Yeah.
Good job. You guys listened and you asked lots of questions. Okay, a few housekeeping type things. Let me get my notes so I don't forget. There are about 16 minutes left in the auction, so bid now or forever hold your peace. Ray, do we still have one that is unbid? So bid on the Badlands ATV park. If you don't, I have to. And last time I got an ATV for my kid, he ran me over with it. So I'd prefer not to do that again. So somebody help me out, please. So John got a little bit of praise earlier. His head's getting bigger by the moment. I just want to echo that as well. Where we are sitting today can very much be attributed to Mr. Goss and his time as head of DNR. Did a lot to make this place what it is. So I think we should all acknowledge that and be thankful for what he's done. And I'm going to just call out by name our board that is here, including 3 lobbyists. So we are on that. Our board has 4 lobbyists on it who are all helping to work the channels they have. And that's important. You know, it's so discouraging sometimes that we're all pretty sure we're right. And in these cases, I think definitively we are. You don't get those easy wins always. And it's just chip away. And it's what we're doing. And, you know, it does, it gets really, really frustrating. I'm sure people get burnt out pretty quickly on this, but human minds are such, we can't really grasp the magnitude of these issues, right? Climate change is potentially going to kill us all, but it's not going to kill us all tomorrow. So why the hell do we care? And that's the way we're wired, and there's some good to that, but it makes these big kind of issues really hard to grapple with. So it's frustrating, but we have to keep doing it. And to the question about what's going to happen with the commission's report, that's up to us. Talk to your officials and make sure they're aware of it, because guess what? It's a part-time legislature. A lot of them don't read any of this stuff. Make sure they're aware of it. Some of them you're not going to convince, but you'd be surprised, right? So it's easy for us to all sit around and gripe about it. I do it, but do something with it. If you want the report, I'll get it to you. Make a meeting with your legislator, legislator, sit down with them and say, hey, this is important to me. I vote. And I joke about this all the time. Even if you don't like your elected official, give them $5 and then you can say you're a donor to their campaign. It's cynical, but it's true, right? Okay, so enough pontificating on my end. So I'm just going to call out our board by name, and then I'm going to try to embarrass our next speaker a little bit. So you guys don't have to stand because you already did, but of our board, most of them are here, and I really, really appreciate that. So Tina has left. She was checking you guys in at the beginning. She helped organize all of this. So huge shout out to Tina, even though she's gone. And then just by name, Chip, Craig, John, Coralie, Stacy, Brent, Lindsay, and Quentin are all here today. And I'm really thankful for you guys for being here and helping to support us. So thank you. And with that, I'm going to go to our next speaker, who inexplicably lives in the great town of Ann Arbor, and I'm going to maybe get some heckling for this, the greatest football team alive and the greatest basketball team alive, the greatest hockey team alive, all live. And somehow, this guy's a Michigan State fan. So, Drew he's not my boss. He's my handler is what I refer to him as. He is my point person in our region of NWF. And I've been fortunate enough to spend a fair amount of time with him recently. We were together down in Louisiana at a conference, and he embodies so much of what IWF and NWF embodies. He's a sportsman. He's an environmentalist. He's passionate about this. He is an awesome fisherman, or so he claims. I guess they all do. But he is, I can vouch for this, a very good tire of flies. Because every time I bid on his set of flies, somebody bids more than me, so stop it. But he practices what he preaches, and he can touch on that a little bit if he wants. But we were talking about this last night. So he is a big fisherman. He ties his own flies. And one of the reasons he's doing this, and one of the things he does with his newly formed company, is he doesn't use any lead in it, right? We were talking about this. Lead is really, really problematic in the environment for wildlife, for sure, but for us too, right? Everyone's heard about lead in water. You don't want it in it, shocker. But he is tying all his flies lead free. And it's same thing with these backyard habitat things, these little changes. As everyone starts to do that, it has big implications. So even though he's a Michigan State fan, I like him, and you guys are in for a treat with Drew.
Thank you. Thank you. The flies up there, yes, I tied them, but I'm here on behalf of National Wildlife Federation. And as you heard earlier, we're the national federation composed of 52 state and territorial affiliates. And the Indiana Wildlife Federation was, of course, our Indiana affiliate. So I'm going to go a little bit over our history, even though Dan hates history. So we were actually formed in 1936. Ding Darling, who was the creator of the duck stamp, convinced President Roosevelt to hold a conference. At the time, really all wildlife were doing pretty poorly. He said, we need to do something about this. Let's get all the different people who care about wildlife from across the country together in a room. They represented diverse conservation interests, not just hunters and anglers, but gardeners, birders, you name it. Everybody who cared about wildlife and had a voice. And I think we have to acknowledge too, not everybody had a voice back then. But for the folks that had a voice, they were in that room. Out of that conference, two things came out of that. We need to create a permanent national voice for wildlife, and we need a funding mechanism to go to the states to help recover them. The first one of those became the General Wildlife Federation. 2 years later, we changed our name to the National Wildlife Federation. That second point became the Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937. So you heard earlier how the sales of firearms, ammunition, hunting equipment, later amended to include also bow hunting equipment. And actually later in 1950, the Dingell-Johnson Act added fishing equipment for aquatic resources, how that funds wildlife conservation. That was a result of that conference and was the very first thing that the National Wildlife Federation, led along with groups like Ducks Unlimited. Now, there's something really important to Indiana about our history. The idea to have a national federation of state affiliated organizations actually came to Ding Darling when years earlier, he had attended a meeting of the predecessor to IWF. I think it was formally started in 1938, but there was kind of more of a loose conservation council that existed before that in Indiana included representatives from all the different interests involved in conservation. That was Ding Darling's model for the National Wildlife Federation. It was his inspiration. He became the first president of the organization, and what many people know us by, Ranger Rick, was established in 1959. Not to be confused with Rodney Raccoon. Is that what I saw out there? Yeah. So our structure, 52 independent state and territorial affiliates, including the Indiana Wildlife Federation. Many of these affiliates are themselves composed of local independent affiliates like rod and gun clubs. Before I came to work for the National Wildlife Federation, I worked for our Michigan affiliate, Michigan United Conservation Clubs, which was a statewide federation of all the local county rod and gun clubs. And about half of our organizations that are affiliated now, of those 52, are kind of that traditional hook and bullet model. The other half are watershed organizations, Audubon organizations, environmental organizations. And so what we do is we try to bring those voices together from across the country. I like to say that we're kind of like the Willie Nelson of conservation, where the hippies and the rednecks can kind of get along and and figure out what we have in common, whether you're out there, hunting, or, you have binoculars and you're birding, as has been mentioned so many times earlier today. We're the national organization that tries to bring those voices together. And that's important because bipartisan conservation efforts work. They work in divided Congresses. When the party in control of Congress switches every couple of years, if you're only an environmental organization and you can only, get things passed when Democrats are in control, you're not going to be very effective long term. Same if your only influence is with the Republicans. By working together, we have credibility with both sides, which means that we can pass conservation bills no matter who's in office. And we really pride ourselves on that. So our historic accomplishments, earlier when I saw Dan's slide, I noticed that several of these are on yours too. And that's no surprise because we get our work done by working with the state affiliates. So the reason that you see some of these mirrored on the excuse me, accomplishments of Indiana Wildlife Federation is because we don't pass these on a national level without the involvement of so many state affiliates leaning in and doing the work and contacting their members of Congress as well. Those last two I want to point out, the John D. Dingle Conservation Management Recreation Act and the Great American Outdoors Act, only because those have been passed since I was on staff. So I got to see those, the way that those were done. Those were passed. Think about those years, 2019, 2020. You had a divided Congress with a Republican president, and we passed two of the largest conservation bills in history. So this doesn't have to be a partisan thing. So these are the current national issues that we're working on. Now we have at the National Wildlife Federation 8 regional centers. We have a headquarters in Reston, Virginia, just outside of Washington, D.C. We have about 400 employees across the country that are composed into different teams with experts on, you know, really every one of these issues. I'm not the expert on that issue, on every one of these issues. So some of these I can't really go into too much details on, but some of them I can. Recovering America's Wildlife Act. That is our #1 priority. This came out of a blue ribbon committee in 2015. That was, this blue ribbon committee included like our CEO, Colin O'Mara, but it included people like Johnny Morris of Bass Pro Shops. And this idea was to fund state wildlife agencies, you know, the state DNRs, taking the same model that we did with Pittman Robertson. But because that primarily targets game species, a lot of the non-game species are kind of left out of that. So we need that same kind of investment in those species. And that's what Recovering America's Wildlife Act would do. 1.6 billion spread amongst state and tribal wildlife agencies to recover the species of greatest conservation need identified in those state wildlife action plans that you've helped your state develop. The way that we describe the Recovering America's Wildlife Act is it's not necessarily the endangered species that will benefit most by this. They're certainly included in that, but it's those species that aren't necessarily endangered yet, but are right on that verge. It's the ones that aren't doing well. A lot of the species of greatest conservation need are not endangered, but they need additional investment to keep them from going toward that level. So it's kind of like really going in for your regular checkup versus waiting until it gets to that emergency room level. So we've heard a few times today about, you know, too often we wait until it's an emergency before we do anything about it. What we're trying to do with the Recovering America's Wildlife Act is proactively recover these species before they get to that tipping point of becoming endangered. You heard about the Farm Bill already. This is a Farm Bill year. Indiana Wildlife Federation is going to be one of our important partners nationally in that because of that committee structure that you heard, as well as the makeup of your state. Chronic wasting disease. I have a little story about chronic wasting disease. So we've been trying to pass what we call the CWD Management and Research Act for a few years now. It was on track to be fast-tracked in the Senate. However, to be fast-tracked, it could be held up by any one senator. So we're on a call and we hear that Senator Rand Paul is the only holdout that's preventing it from being fast-tracked. However, we also got intelligence that apparently Senator Braun is a friend of his. And there was a question on this call if anybody can contact Senator Braun. So I got a hold of Dan and he says, you know, I need to introduce myself to his office anyways. Dan had a meeting with his office, talked about CWD, the CWD Management Act. You said it was a positive reception. Now it still didn't get fast-tracked, but in the omnibus bill, they authorized $70 million for the CWD Management and Research Act, but it's nothing that made it into that omnibus bill made it in if it didn't have sign off from both parties, because Senator McConnell, even as a minority leader, could hold off, you know, lots of things going into that bill. So because you had Republican senators who were supportive of that, like Senator Braun, because of that conversation, we got that in there. That's the type of collaboration on just a micro scale that allows us to pass big national bills by working with the state affiliates. Water Resources Development Act, that was passed earlier, you know, just at the end of last year as well. we'll talk a little bit later about invasive carp. You've heard about it a lot. One of the big things they're trying to do to keep them out of the Great Lakes is the Brandon Road Lock and Dam. Within that Water Resources Development Act, we changed the federal cost share to 90% rather than, I think it was at 80% before, and it's normally 65%. Is that correct? 70%, right? But that dramatically reduced the local cost share that Illinois has to come up with, and that probably a lot of other states like Michigan will pitch in with anyways. But that helps get that done, to make that go a little bit faster. Try to make sure that we can complete that project before invasive carp make it past that barrier. So I work out of the Great Lakes Regional Center. You saw on Dan's map earlier kind of how we break out the different regions. The Great Lakes Regional Center is based in Ann Arbor, which is the only reason I live there. And my wife works for U of M, but she's a Spartan too. I'm happy to take their money. But we cover the states of Illinois, Ohio, Indiana. Those are the states that I work with as the Director of Conservation Partnerships. And then we also work with Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota in our region. We were established in 1982, our regional center. Our affiliates are, as I mentioned, Michigan United Conservation Clubs, who I used to work for, Wisconsin Wildlife Federation, who, as I understand, is working with the Crane Foundation. And I tell you what, you will not find a more hook and bullet traditional that is stuck to that model than Wisconsin Wildlife Federation. So I think it really speaks to the collaborative efforts of the different aspects of wildlife conservation that they're working with the Crane Foundation. That's the model that we try to embody, and at times we kind of go off to one side or the other, but it's the center that we try to keep. Now for our Great Lakes region too, you've heard this man's name a few times today, John Goss. We're lucky that he's on our board of directors too. He is the representative for Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio on the National Wildlife Federation Board of Directors. So thank you for that service as well, John. The reason we were started in Ann Arbor is because we have a partnership with the University of Michigan Law School's Environmental Law Clinic. So we have that resource available. When you have tricky legal questions, you know, in Indiana, if you need, you know, for instance, a group of legal law students to research a tricky legal question and provide you with a brief that can give you the state of that, we have that resource available to Indiana Wildlife Federation as well as our other affiliates in the region. We staff the Healing Our Waters Great Lakes Coalition along with the National Parks Conservation Association. We house a Sacred Grounds Habitat program. This is kind of like the backyard habitat program, but they actually partner with houses of worship, churches, synagogues, mostly in low-income neighborhoods, to provide that kind of natural place of peace that can provide habitat for wildlife as well as a calming influence in neighborhoods that often need it. And we advocate on Great Lakes issues, which I'll go into more detail in here. So our major Great Lakes region priorities, pretty general headings, but protect our natural resources and wildlife, safeguard our drinking water. This is actually a new turn for us over the last few years, again, spurred by an emergency. The Flint water crisis in Michigan, when that hit, it was actually us going out on a limb to advocate on that because people didn't often look at drinking water as, you know, a wildlife conservation issue. But we saw it as an important people issue that was also a natural resources issue, our water. You know, we often talk about the Great Lakes as a source of drinking water for 30 million people, but we can't make that claim if we're not also advocating for how you get that drinking water to people in a healthy manner. We're working on restoring our watersheds, protecting public lands and wildlife, and advancing climate solutions and resiliency. So protecting our natural resources and wildlife. You've heard this one before too. Stop the spread of invasive species. That is actually me holding the silver carp that jumped in our boat when we were filming Against the Current, which is a film we made about the threat of invasive carp. I'm actually wearing the hat, by the way, underneath that sun hoodie. which probably attracted it. But that was by Lafayette. We went in a little side channel, a little side pond off the main river there, turned the motors on, and they were jumping all over the place. I'd never experienced that before. I've been advocating on the issue since law school, and that was the first time I'd ever seen them. But that one there about took my legs out. So it really helped me understand the threat of them. Being from Michigan, we don't have them there yet, and we're trying to keep it that way. So it was important for me to come down and see that. And it was an eye opener for sure. We're trying to protect the Great Lakes from harmful algal blooms and secure water and wildlife conservation funding through the Farm Bill. I mentioned it before, but you're going to be hearing a lot from us about the Farm Bill this year. Dan's going to hear a lot from us about it. And we're going to be really leaning in heavily on that this year. Safeguarding our drinking water. There was something that you said earlier. We should be able to eat the fish that we catch from our waters. If you go down to protecting people and wildlife from PFAS, in Michigan, we have a major PFAS problem. PFAS are the forever chemicals. They're kind of everything from old nonstick pans to firefighting equipment. I live in Ann Arbor, the Huron River that flows through it. You can't eat the fish from it right now because an electroplating facility released PFAS into the river that still hasn't gone away. I take my boy down there to catch bluegills. He's going to be 4 pretty soon. But I can't let him keep them and show him how we clean them and eat them and show him that connection at that place in the river that runs through our town because we can't eat the fish from the river. That's something that we're advocating on and really diving in from our regional office. We found it in Michigan, frankly, because we've looked for it. I think the more that it's tested for, across the country, we're going to find it more. We found it in Michigan because we had a crisis with it. And so we started looking for it in more places. It seems to be one of those things that the more it's tested for, the more it's found. Restoring watersheds. So we have 3 major watershed restoration programs. We have the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. Many of you are familiar with that. We're advocating for the fully authorized $400 million that Congress has authorized for that. Has never actually been funded to that level, although we did get a boost this last year. We're working on a multi-state Ohio River restoration program as well. What we're trying to do is replicate what led to the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative. We've been meeting with stakeholders across the Ohio River Basin, working on a plan that can present the case that we can present to Congress that makes the case for that same kind of dedicated funding to restore the Ohio River watershed. And we're doing the same with the Mississippi River restoration as well. There's an idea, a program called MIRI, Mississippi River Restoration. There's another R in there and then an initiative. But we're working on that too. And in the same type of manner, we're really trying to take what we did with the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative and replicate it across the other major watersheds that run through the region. Protecting public lands and wildlife. I mentioned the Recovering America's Wildlife Act. To build on how close we were last year. We were still in the running to be included in the omnibus until 11:30 at night with a midnight deadline of what got in there. Somehow within that last half hour, what happened was they couldn't agree on the funding mechanism for it. They were close. They were looking at, some sort of closing some sort of loophole on crypto. I think a lot of you heard what was going on with crypto at the time. It really had nothing to do with the content of the bill. There was a lot of agreement from both parties with the content of the bill, but they couldn't agree on how to pay for it. That's something that we're getting an early start on, trying to make sure that we can introduce it early and get that through this term. Recovering America's Wildlife Act is something that wildlife needs, so we're not giving up on that. It's been introduced every term since 2016. We're going to keep introducing it. We're going to keep advocating on it. We're going to keep fighting it until we get it done. Supporting the Boundary Waters Canoe Area. You may have seen just recently in the news, new protections ordered for that through the Department of the Interior. strengthen access to public lands and waters, and advancing solutions to chronic wasting disease. So that's a regional priority as well as national. And again, thank you to the Indiana Wildlife Federation for helping get that bill through. Advancing climate solutions, working on removing the Line 5 oil pipeline from the Straits of Mackinac, advancing climate policies, strengthening coastal resiliency. And that's really what we're working on from the region. You know, it's been a real pleasure to get to know Dan a little bit since he's come on board. I'm really excited for Indiana Wildlife Federation. I think that your organization, working with other organizations, I kind of get to see where different statewide organizations are throughout the country. You seem like you're right there. You're right at the precipice of really getting on board with growing, doing great things, and becoming a power in Indiana. National Wildlife Federation, we're there to help. Whatever resources that you need from us, whatever help that you need, we're here to be called upon. And that's kind of what this relationship is. You're an independent affiliate. You're not a chapter. We don't get to tell you what to do. What happens at our annual meeting is all the organizations like you get together and tell us what our policies are. We try to leverage our expertise and national reach to get them done. And we usually do that by coming back to you in the States and asking you to contact your senator or congressman. So it's a really symbiotic relationship. We appreciate it. I thank you all for being here as well as for having me here. And I'm happy to take questions.
I was just wondering what kind of partnerships, if any, National Wildlife regionally, nationally, or even locally has with like indigenous tribes or like minority targeted outdoors groups or anything like that?
Yeah, so we have a new initiative. We've been doing a lot of internal work over the last couple of years to make sure that our culture internally within NWF is ready to form those partnerships in an authentic way. We actually started that work well before I think it was, you know, you saw a lot of other organizations going into it. In order to form those relationships in an authentic way, it's important that we approach it from what we call avoiding what we call transactional relationships. So we're trying to make sure that we go about that not as dropping in on a community and telling them we have all the answers, but forming authentic partnerships, overseeing what their priorities are. We do have some partnerships with some of the tribal nations. Those are tricky because they are sovereign nations. And so it's important to remember when we're going about those, that we're dealing with really separate governments that have different ways about that. So we're approaching that authentically. We're approaching that deliberately, but it's something that we're forming more of every day. It did, and it had that because in previous versions of the Recovering America's Wildlife Act did not include tribal agencies. Before it was introduced, before the last term, we brought tribal wildlife agencies into it to tell us what they need. There were, you know, so it's 1.6 billion. I think before it was 1.3. So that's, you do the math, but that extra is for tribal wildlife agencies. And that was because they got a seat at the table. When I mentioned that when we were formed in 1936, not everybody had a voice, you know, that's real. And it's something that for a long time went unaddressed. So it's something that is that really at the forefront of the way that NWF is redoing, for instance, looking at what is our vision statement? What is our mission? How do we make sure that we include all Americans? Because our mission is ensuring wildlife thrive by connecting all Americans. And if we're not including all, then we're really not achieving our mission. So it's something that is at the forefront of what we're doing and what we're working on. What I don't want to say is that we're doing, the perfect job of it. It's hard work. Lots of us that are in it got in it strictly with an eye toward wildlife. And so we're getting there, but we're not there yet.
We have a question from someone online. Adrian would like to know, to what extent are these conservation projects creating jobs and having positive economic impacts?
So there's different statewide studies on that. Michigan United Conservation Clubs, I think it was 2 or 3 years ago, commissioned a study at least to see what the impact of recreation, outdoor recreation, hunting and fishing was in Michigan, at least. I think they come up with a figure of 11.3 billion. When you factor in equipment, lodging, travel, everything together, as well as the people employed in that sector, that was their level for that state. I know that because it was after I worked for them, but I've heard their executive director quote that number multiple times. So that's at the top of mind. There's different numbers for that actually are available for every state. And so it's to that level, really for every state that has a strong, outdoor recreation economy.
Yeah, I was just trying to look up the number. I saw it. Inca put it out. I think it's $11 is generated for every $1 that goes into outdoor recreation in Indiana. So it's a pretty darn good return on investment.
Yep.
Speaking of the Great Lakes, seems like the big differences that has been made there, and Lake Erie being an example, has been getting rid of industrial waste. But I suppose you're aware of the BP refinery in Whiting, and it seems to be still, according to Indianapolis Star article this week, pretty much unregulated, or they're not regulating it. You guys, is that on your radar?
I'll be honest, it's not. That's the first that I've known about it. So thank you for bringing it to our radar.
Read that, really bad.
Yep.
Okay, I think we have some auction results.
All right. Thank you.
Is Kathleen Beretta in the house? You have won Indigo Bird and Nature Tours. Congratulations. Darren Chittick. Okay. John Whitten. I guess I'll tell you what they won. Darren won Eagle Creek Pass, and John won the Wolf Park family membership. Amy Silva. A book. I forget what it is because Ray stole it. Wildflowers of the Midwest. She's going to build a backyard national park. Thomas Dobbin. A Two Forks day-long guided fishing trip. Catherine not here. She also won Eagle Creek. I know he's here. Chris Carpenter won the Holiday Park Pavilion. Susan Gerhart. No. Eagle Creek annual pass. I won that, so we don't have to talk about that. Vicky Stump. Cheryl Swift won the biplane ride. Jason DeArmond. Guided fishing trip through moving waters. Roxanne Malloy. Yoga studio. Vogue concerts. Chip Garver. Don't go to Guar. Oh, Stacy, you got a bonus. She got the behind the scenes zoo tour with Megan Marr and a flamingo footprint painted. Elizabeth Isaacson, you won the climbing passes at Epic. Thank you. Tracy Willis, you won the Wild Birds gift pack. Quentin, you're the one who was bidding against me. He won Drew's flies. Roxanne won the guided herpetological outing. Thanks, Jim and Hoosier Herp. Lori Bruner. She won the lake cottage rental. And these are not here, but will be delivered or sent. Craig, you won lot 29 of the terrestrial flies. Roxanne won 2 sets of flies, the dozen nymph and wet flies and the dozen streamer flies. Susan Conaway won a lot of 1 dozen streamer flies, and all of this lot of 4 flies was all from John Vargo. Quentin, don't drink this now. You won wine to go along with your flies. Sounds like a great afternoon. And thank you guys very much. That is the end of the auction. We get a few housekeeping notes. Basically, all I'm going to say is thank you guys so much for coming out. Thank you for supporting IWF. Please stick around. We are going to have a beer and wine hour after Rick makes some announcements, and you can ask everyone the questions you didn't want to ask in public.
Thank you, Dan. Thanks, everybody, for being here. It's been a phenomenal day. Ann, Will, Collie, Drew, I have the authority to hereby make you honorary members. So thank you for being here today. The planning committee, you guys knocked it out of the park. The board, thank you. Our sponsors and our donors. And the last thing, second to the last thing I have to say before I adjourn is anybody that's been through a hiring process knows that it's kind of a roll of the dice. You think you've got one, you think you've got a keeper. I think Dan has shown us today we have a keeper. So a round of applause for Dan getting us through this first event. If you were here this morning, I made an allusion to Saturday Night Live, so I'll end on one. The meeting is adjourned. The bar is open.